The beginning of that incident started with a relic that belonged to her mother, a necklace with a picture of some golden flowers. And not just that, but at the moment the protagonist, a young girl with golden hair and pink eyes, saw the necklace fall to the ground and break, various memories flowed like running water in her mind. Among them was a familiar voice saying, "One day, you will regret this." Above all, a name called Yoon Ga-yeol suddenly came to her mind. When she woke up, the protagonist was in a bright place above a surface of water without understanding. However, when she looked around, she noticed it was a city with cars and a blue sky. Behind her, a woman approached asking if the girl was okay, and she hesitantly agreed. But the woman got closer while watching the girl stand up, asking if she really didn't need help. Then the protagonist said she was fine, asking the woman to continue her walk until she looked at her reflection and noticed it was different from her original appearance. The shock made her start hearing voices until she finally woke up a second time on the ground, with several maids worried about her, addressing her as Miss Elodie. Those memories that appeared out of nowhere, flowing back into her mind, made her sigh and nervously think it was truly the end. These memories were precisely from her past life in another world. Her name was Elodie Perdia, the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Perdia and also the Duke's only daughter. She only had memories as Elodie up to that age, but suddenly, she broke her mother's belongings and remembered her past life. However, this made her wonder if she could truly call it a past life. This life was a novel called How the Adopted Daughter of the Villain Family Becomes Loved, which she ended up reading in her previous life. Now, she was possessing a character within that novel, but her big problem was precisely Elodie Perdia, because she always committed various malicious acts and ended up dying young as a consequence. In other words, she was a wicked woman who was executed for her deeds. Remembering this made her sigh, realizing she was truly condemned in that complicated life. Elodie remembered all the memories of her previous life, but she hadn't forgotten those as Elodie. It would have been better if she had been born with memories from the beginning. However, she didn't know why this was happening only now. After all, her past self as Elodie was cruel and squandered her fortunes. If she continued this way, she would end up losing her life just like in the original novel. First, she had to organize this because she couldn't die like the original Elodie, so she got up to prepare the order of her memories. It was true that she was a wicked person, but that wasn't what led to their execution. There were other causes that led to it. But in the end, the biggest problem was that her father, the Duke of Perdia, was the cruelest villain in the world. As a heartless villain, he didn't care about the death of his daughter, even though he was her father. The reason why the Duke of Perdia didn't care about his daughter's death was that the heroine of that novel was a maiden named Estelle. Estelle Perdia, although adopted for political reasons, due to her unique beauty, was able to melt the hearts of the family and ended up happily married. This was a story of a fantastical romance with the genre of healing fiction. Elodie became the fiancée of the first prince, but because of her bad reputation and frequent malicious actions, the engagement was cancelled. The father, who was the head of the Perdia Duchy, a cruel family, tried to strengthen his power through the first prince. So he adopted the heroine Estelle and tried to make her the new fiancée of the first prince. Considering the organization of the memories, the protagonist thought she should leave that house. First, she needed to stay out of sight of the Duke of Perdia and his family. If she ran away, she would certainly be captured, and if she left suddenly, it would be even more suspicious. Before Estelle was adopted, Elodie had to leave that house and live independently. Certainly, they wouldn't allow something like that easily, and the protagonist knew that very well, but she intended to do whatever it took, and the first idea she had to do was a specific one. After Elodie wrote down all her ideas on paper, she sighed with relief for having finished. Thinking of a handsome man with silver hair and green eyes, it seemed to be time to let him go. It was nice to live with the handsome face of a man, but she was ready to send this guy away. Still, she wondered if it shouldn't be more important to live first, even though breaking the engagement with the first prince was important. Sometime later, at the palace, the prince received a letter that was signed by the Perdia family. It was probably from Elodie, as the prince once said he wanted to discuss the emperor's birthday banquet with her. Ademir Prizor-Walent, the first prince of the Walentia Empire, opened the letter to see the message written and widened his eyes in surprise. Letting out a scornful laugh, his assistant asked what had happened. In the letter, she apologized because she couldn't find time to spend with him and asked him to sign the attached letter and send it back. This irritated the prince, wondering what kind of joke this was. At another moment, the protagonist was called by her father to talk, feeling a bit nervous about meeting him. The Duke began by saying there was a problem, and Elodie became tense. When she felt the time had come, she wondered why someone who didn't care about anything she did would call her about something that happened with a maid some time ago. However, she wondered if the call was because of the banquet confusion, until Duke Sylvester Perdia called her name. Demanding to know from her own mouth what she was thinking, extracting an apology from her, he was taken aback when, despite trying to understand her point of view, Elodie just kept apologizing over and over. Sylvester mentioned that a few days ago, she sent a letter requesting to break the engagement, and the prince contacted him about it. The protagonist smiled and agreed that it was true, making the Duke say that he always turned a blind eye to Elodie, but this was different, and questioned why she wanted the engagement from the start. Elodie replied that she thought it wouldn't be a problem because in the past her father was against the engagement, but he answered that the situation had changed. This was an engagement that both the Duke and the first prince didn't want, which made the protagonist think they would break the engagement willingly if she wanted. But she never imagined that Ademir would contact the Duke before everything. This made her ask if her father meant that he didn't approve of the breakup, and when he agreed, she hesitantly understood. Hearing that she would also be on probation for now, Elodie agreed again with her father's words, leaving them in a long, awkward and tense silence in that office, until the protagonist tried to say something, asking if there was anything else he wanted to tell her. Then, after a moment, he denied and sent her out to reflect, and Elodie agreed, turning to leave. The Duke watched her leave under the glow of the sunset. As she closed the door, Elodie sighed because it was indeed very scary. It seemed that breaking engagements wasn't easy, but she had been expecting this, so she decided to return to the pavilion first. After all, she had forced this from the beginning, whether she liked it or not. This should mean that the Duke of Perdia supported the first prince, and if that was the case, it wasn't something that could change at her will. She thought she couldn't be so impatient. After all, she still had 3 years to organize things. During this period, she had to be able to turn things around to become independent, no matter what happened. In ancient times, that world was brought to the brink of total destruction by beings known as the 7 deadly sins, serving the goddess of the underworld Akala, who coveted both the heavens and the earth. The 7 deadly sins caused death and destruction across the continent under her command. Then, when the world fell to its knees, a young woman with silver hair appeared from the heavens. Ishtar, the younger sister of Akala and the goddess of the heavens and the earth, descended to save it, sharing her celestial blessings with 7 chosen mortals in the form of special powers. She summoned them to defeat and seal the 7 deadly sins. Ishtar's human heralds emerged victorious, hailed as heroes, each founding a noble house in their own name. Thus arose the legend behind the founding of the Walentia Empire. In modern times, only 5 of the 7 great houses remain, including the Imperial House. Among them, the Perdia house was known as the guardian of the blessing of destruction. On the way through the house, the protagonist froze when a young man with black hair greeted her by the nickname Lily, making her give a nervous laugh and agree that it had indeed been a long time. She had a feeling she might meet those 2 at the main residence, but fortunately for her, it happened after a reprimand. They were her brothers, Yancy Perdia, the first son and heir, and the second son, Carlot Perdia. Yancy approached to ask about the request to annul the engagement, and Elodie agreed that it was true, with Carlot saying that his sister was obviously rejected. This irritated the protagonist because the younger one seemed to have forgotten that she was 2 years older than him. The hare asked if the Duke was furious, and she didn't think that was the case, as she had just been punished since then. This brought a smile to Yancy, as it could have been much worse. Yancy Perdia, as the direct heir of the Perdia lineage, had a blessing running through his veins with only one purpose: obliteration. His power to erase something from existence was feared by all, but the true source of terror that made everyone so cautious of Yancy stemmed from his character. Behind the illusion of kindness hid a calculating heart of ice, more than happy to trample on others' lives if it benefited him. Swallowing dryly, the protagonist knew he was completely treacherous. But now her heart could almost be deceived by Yancy's gentle behavior, worried if she was feeling unwell, and by Carlotte's malicious comments, suggesting that Elodie should examine her own troubled head now that she was being punished, still teasing his older sister with a smile. The protagonist could only get more irritated with the jokes until Yancy reprimanded Carlotte because he knew how he felt about that kind of talk, surprising Elodie, saying that they shared the same blood and should always take care of the family. The younger one questioned if they were really related to that thing they called a sister. Yancy agreed it was obvious because Ishtar had blessed him with 2 dear siblings, and thus he also looked at the protagonist. She couldn't tell how Yancy could lie so blatantly like that, but she still hesitantly thanked her brother. Then she asked for permission to go to the annex, commenting that it was very nice to see her brothers, and Yancy agreed because they should see each other more often. As she left, Carlotte commented to his brother that he almost emptied his stomach, seeing that little tyrant, who remained silent. Hearing Carlotte question what happened with Elodie today, Yancy agreed that she didn't seem to be her normal self because something seemed different about her. Yancy and Carl showed their blessings when they were still children. Ishtar's blessings were transmitted to all direct descendants of the founding houses of Valentia, but Elodie had been an unfortunate exception her entire life. This was because the great truth was that Elodie was not the true Perdia. Although she was publicly known as the Duke's daughter out of wedlock, in reality, she wasn't even that, as there wasn't a drop of Perdia blood in her veins. And as soon as it was exposed that she had no relation to the Perdia house, that great snowball happened. It was just another reason to secure her freedom before being discovered, having at least one good side to that terrible situation. It made her give a dark little laugh that even scared the poor maids around in the garden, who whispered among themselves that Elodie had certainly lost her mind. But the protagonist was laughing because she would never have known this if she hadn't recovered her old memories. Fortunately for her, she knew she would one day manifest a blessing she inherited from her biological parents. And it wasn't just any blessing, but one of purification granted to the house of the Duke of Servers. Not so fortunately, in the novel, manifesting her true blessing would only lead to her being discovered as a false Perdia and condemned to execution. This made her wonder why all timelines ended with her death just because she wasn't the Duke's true daughter. And yet, Duke Richard Servers, her biological father and head of the Servers house, was in a deep coma showing no signs of waking up. In the end, Elodie had no luck as she needed to wait for any help from him. She thought that when her blessing manifested, she should try to hide it as best as possible to use it to gain her freedom before being fully exposed. The protagonist walked to the Perdia Duchess's garden, thinking it was truly dazzling to her eyes, though its beauty hid more than just a few mortal dangers. Still, it was there that her attempt at freedom began, making her swallow dryly again. From inside the garden, the sound of high heels made her hear until a voice commented that it wasn't often Elodie appeared there. The red-haired woman, smiling, didn't know she needed to expect her visit and asked what brought her to the garden. This was Demis Perdia, wife of Duke Perdia, biological mother of Yancy and Carl, and the greatest poison specialist in all of Valentia. Elodie greeted the Duchess, smiling as she replied that she missed her, but didn't expect to meet her, and suggested they could talk while taking a nice walk through the glass greenhouse. Surprised, Dennis asked if it was really okay to walk through her greenhouse, bringing a big smile to Elodie, who agreed that by chance, her question was related to the excellent work the Duchess was doing. After thinking for a bit, the Duchess turned and said she could do as she pleased, making Elodie thank her and respond that it was really kind of her. Suddenly, Demis stopped and warned the protagonist that there were many things inside the greenhouse that could harm her, so she couldn't touch anything without her permission. Elodie quickly responded that she wouldn't dream of doing anything like that, following the Duchess right after. When they entered the greenhouse, she asked what the girl would like to talk about. Elodie said she heard a small rumor that apparently the Imperial Palace left an order for the Duchess. Demis asked her to continue, and the protagonist commented that it seemed unfair after all the effort she made for the common farmers. How could they order Demis to destroy all the stock of pesticides she had developed? The Duchess appreciated the sentiment, but there was nothing to prevent it. as she created the pesticide for the good of the people, but couldn't deny that the substance was toxic to humans. Elodie approached, excited, when she said that this was where she entered the story, as she believed she could help the Duchess with her case. Sighing, Demis asked what Elodie could do to help. The protagonist showed a vial of golden liquid, surprising the Duchess, who asked what it was. Elodie responded that this was the solution to her situation, an antidote, a counteragent of her own creation. That was her second step on her path to freedom, to earn money and get paid. Demis asked how she could believe what she was hearing now, hoping it wasn't a bad joke to mock her. The protagonist assured it was nothing to be suspicious of, so she suggested they could test it. If the solution didn't work, she could return the product with a guarantee, making the Duchess agree, agreeing to entertain the girl at that moment. Inviting her to come closer, Demis gestured to the protagonist, and she promptly hurried closer. The Duchess asked her to take a look at what was on the table, catching Elodie's attention, who responded that it should be an unusually large worm inside a glass box. Demis explained it wasn't a common worm, as it was actually a vermin, the cause of the latest plague. A terrible creature with its remarkable resilience and reproductive capacity was the greatest threat to crops. Certainly, there wasn't a better test subject for the counteragent Elodie had brought. The protagonist noticed they were putting the pesticide on the vermin, and the Duchess said that once the creature was under its influence, they would see if a supposed antidote could bring it back to life, and thus she applied the antidote to the vermin inside the box. Waiting, Elodie clasped her hands, not doubting her potion but feeling tense because it was being tested by the Duchess in front of her own eyes. Even knowing it was a pest, she prayed for it to hold on because humanity's well-being and her financial future depended on it. After closing her eyes, hoping it would work, she opened them to witness the vermin moving, making Elodie celebrate because the vermin was indeed alive, surprising Demis when the girl grabbed her arm. Celebrating that the antidote had beaten the poison, she slowly became embarrassed and apologized because she wasn't trying to belittle Demis's work, eliciting a smile from her, despite the protagonist trying to remember that she wasn't friends with the Duchess. But the Duchess replied that there was no reason to apologize because she was just impressed. After all, Elodie had always been fearful and quiet by her side, but it seemed things had changed. Anyway, Demis believed she owed a fair price for that wonderful antidote, making the protagonist very happy because she succeeded, and she responded that she had one condition: to sell the antidote in Demis's name, not hers. Surprised, the Duchess heard the protagonist affirm that in return, she could receive a share of the profit in money. But Demis still wanted to know why Elodie's name should be absent, and she replied that it was because no one would believe she did it, of course. Besides, she preferred not to draw attention to herself, so she preferred to keep the business secret. This was the only way to disappear without a trace when the time came. Thus, Demis agreed because she would not have any losses with those conditions, but she also had her own conditions and questioned how she was able to create such a good potion alone. Elodie said that a few days ago, her celestial blessing had finally manifested, shocking the Duchess again. But the girl explained that she had the power to destroy the harmful effects of a poison, although she could actually purify the poison, not destroy it. In the original novel, Elodie planned to poison Estelle with a deadly poison, but she herself ingested the poison. Due to her purification blessing, Elodie did not succumb to the lethal effect of that poison, and with the nature of her power revealed, she was identified as a false Perdia, a little innocent lie to spare her from a tragic death. It seemed unlikely that Demis would be thrilled with the news of her new blessing. The Duchess said she was happy because Elodie found her blessing, but she didn't understand the reason to keep it a secret and not celebrate it. The protagonist agreed, but didn't want to cause any unnecessary misunderstanding. As stupid as it might seem, she knew her place under her father's roof, and what she was trying to say was that Demis didn't need to worry about her, one way or another. This was because she was an unwanted child for the Perdia house, posing no threat to the Duchess or her sons. With that, Demis agreed to the terms and commented that it was quite considerate of Elodie, and the girl thanked her because the Duchess was equally understanding. But it was the least she could do for her business partner, and the Duchess was happy about their future dealings. Back in her room, the protagonist threw herself on the bed, exhausted. A maid was worried because she was as pale as Caliph since she went to see Demis. Martha, the maid, hoped Elodie wasn't sick and asked what led her to enter a poisonous den because it could ruin her skin that way. Even though she said her skin was the only good thing about her, it didn't seem like a very kind comment. But the maid insisted she was worried because if something happened, she would lose her only source of income, once again making Elodie realize that if she hadn't been her nanny for years, she would have certainly sent her away for being so rude and straightforward. However, Elodie covered herself and confirmed she was fine, also saying that Demis was as beautiful as ever in case that was what she was interested in knowing. This made Martha agree because she certainly didn't age, and as she didn't know her well, she could say she was the sister of her own daughter because of how young she looked. The protagonist sat up immediately upon hearing this, and Martha took advantage of making her move because there was a guest waiting for Elodie, making her curious because she couldn't think of anyone who would want to see her. And Martha commented that as she was her only friend in the world, unfortunately, she had to agree, eliciting another sigh from Elodie with those painful comments. Jokes aside, the maid suggested she hurry because it was a guest who couldn't keep waiting. Finally, Elodie insisted on knowing who exactly was the guest waiting for her. Naturally, Martha said it was the Crown Prince of Valentia, Adamir. A little later, the prince, who was waiting while drinking his tea, was surprised to hear running footsteps and seeing Elodie open the door abruptly upon arriving. Apologizing because it was never her intention to keep him waiting, Adamir replied it was all right as long as he could join her because they had much to discuss. Nervous, Elodie said that before anything else, she had to emphasize her request for annulment was genuine, and she regretted pressuring him to accept a fiancé he never wanted before. But his rude response, that she didn't seem anything like the Elodie he knew, and that she seemed possessed, left her a bit surprised. She gave a fake smile in return, replying that she was perfectly fine, while Adamir commented that she looked a bit pale. Elodie then mentioned that her father was opposing the annulment, and she would be grateful if the prince could say something sensible to the duke, as he never listened to her. The prince then questioned the reason for her desire to annul the marriage, catching him by surprise when Elodie responded that she had fallen in love. Despite being embarrassed to admit it, even she knew it would be a disgrace for him to marry when she had another man in her heart, so she implored for the annulment. However, Adamir stated that he wouldn't go back on his words so easily. He thought something seemed wrong because Elodie coveted the title of crown princess, so how could she have found another love so soon? Once, she even claimed that her affection for him was genuine, but now her disinterest was clear in all her behavior. When he got lost in thought, Elodie asked if he was even listening to her. However, the prince was still considering that her attitude changing overnight was very suspicious. There must be more to it than it seemed. His response that he wouldn't back down on his previous answer left the protagonist surprised. Adamir said that if this was an immature way for Elodie to try to get attention, it certainly wouldn't succeed. There would be no problem in granting an annulment if that was truly what she wanted, but it wasn't a matter to be decided on whims. It could be discussed properly at the right time, and Elodie felt her mind a bit confused. Adamir began talking about the preparations for his father's birthday banquet when the protagonist started feeling a bit dizzy, eliciting a laugh from Adamir, who believed she was pretending to be fragile to attract his sympathy, which was ridiculous. When Elodie actually fainted on the sofa, he was completely caught by surprise and stood up from his seat, asking if it was an act or something. And if it was a bad joke, and she shouldn't try to humiliate herself like that. He approached and leaned in to shake Elodie, telling her to get up. However, that's when he noticed she was actually unconscious, realizing she had truly fainted. The prince carried her in his arms and shouted for someone to help them, but there was no response from outside, completely silent, making Adamir grit his teeth because even being an illegitimate daughter, it was a disgrace that there was no servant to attend to her in a moment of need. Thus, he carried her through the corridors, wondering what he had gotten himself into. With the duke's daughter in his arms, Adamir set out to find a guest room to lay her down. It didn't take long for him to leave the drawing room, finding the maid Martha, who was always by Elodie's side. Thanks to her help, he managed to lay her to rest in a nearby room, only to be informed by the maid that this wasn't the first time it had happened, but the prince noticed she seemed unconcerned. Was it all the concern she could gather when her mistress fainted? That's when the prince noticed a cut on the protagonist's wrist, certainly from a blade. Confined in a guest house with hardly any domestic staff, with her only servant seemingly indifferent to her collapse, and a blade wound on her arm that no one cared to treat. At least, the prince was relieved because her condition didn't seem life-threatening. When he saw her hands trembling and cold sweat on her forehead, he assumed Elodie was just nervous in his presence, but in the end, she was truly sick. Adamir felt ashamed for underestimating her, doubting her health in that way. He was so sure he had seen enough of Elodie, and he held her hand while she was unconscious, realizing now that he didn't truly know her at all. Later, the protagonist woke up and felt her head hurting, realizing she had fainted because of the toxin residues when she was preparing the antidote. When her blessing manifested, she discovered there were some conditions to trigger its effect. First, she had to ingest the poison herself. Once it was inside her, she could apply her blessing to any ordinary water, creating the counteragent for the poison. Elodie also discovered that she could use her blood instead if she didn't have time. Initially, she just wanted to prick her skin, but her hand slipped. However, she didn't remember changing the dressings on the cut. Perhaps the doctor came and left while she was unconscious. This was because she thought the doctor didn't have time to care for children born out of wedlock and wondered if he had changed his policy by acting this way. That's when Martha appeared, noticing that Elodie had finally woken up and bringing hot water, for which she thanked her. Seeing that she also brought medicine, she questioned why it was in powder form. Anyway, the protagonist asked where the prince was, and while drinking the medicine, Martha said he left as soon as the doctor arrived. This didn't surprise her, as she must have fainted right in front of him during the conversation, but it shouldn't matter. The maid said that Adamir asked her to give this to her as soon as she woke up and handed her a letter, making her wonder why he thought this was necessary. When she opened it, the maid was anxious to know what it was about, especially because Elodie froze in shock upon seeing it. It was a letter about the birthday banquet in honor of the emperor, and that he would arrive at the duke's mansion exactly half an hour before the ball, hoping for her company. Elodie had requested the annulment of the engagement, only to receive an invitation to the ball in response. She screamed in surprise, making a big fuss because she was counting on the annulment and wasn't worried about a dress to wear. But Martha shouted back that there was no reason to worry because she had everything under control, surprising her because she was attentive in all the wrong ways. The protagonist replied that the banquet was the least of her worries, but she didn't understand why the prince wouldn't authorize the annulment already, making the maid sigh and suggest that Adamir might have finally fallen in love with her, eliciting a laugh from Elodie because it was absurd. She stared at Martha intensely and frighteningly, telling her never to say such things again. It was definitely a problem, but she still had plenty of time to resolve it, and it would certainly work out. There were still 3 years left for the Duke to adopt Estelle, and her preparations were well underway to gain her independence by then. Until that day arrived, her only recourse was to accumulate cash, or at least that was what she hoped. A few days later, in the mansion's hall, she encountered a small but unexpected obstacle. A familiar face greeted the protagonist with a smile, but as soon as she saw that face, she remembered one of the passages from the book. Who would have suspected his gentle face? Hector Arold, the most trusted advisor of Duke Perdia, a man who devoted himself to his lord with canine loyalty. In the end, he stabbed the Duke in the back without being discovered. That man was Hector Arold, a future traitor who in 3 years would be crucial in revealing the secrets of her lineage. In How to Find Love being the unwanted adopted daughter of a villainous family, Elodie tries to poison Estelle, but her deadly plan fails when the poisoned wine glass she prepared was swapped with her own glass. Although Elodie drank the poisoned wine, her newly awakened purification blessing negated its lethal effect, only to trade a tragic end for another. When her true identity was revealed as anything but the illegitimate daughter of Duke Perdia, after all was said and done, Elodie met her fate, being despised and abandoned. Who was responsible for swapping the fateful wine glass? Hector himself, who now greeted her. Hector betrayed the Perdia house in favor of the second prince because Duke Perdia supported the first prince for the throne. He decided to switch the poison with a single objective: to break the alliance between the crown prince and the Perdia house. The question was to discover how long he had been an agent of the second prince. It would take 3 years for his betrayal to be revealed, making Elodie wonder if there was a way to discern his true intentions in the present. How could that dog's smile hide the smile of a hyena? It wasn't possible to read a person's heart this way. Even so, since she didn't intend to give Hector a reason to take her life, she didn't need to distrust him now, and she also had no plans to get rid of Estelle. After a long moment, the protagonist replied that she was just taking a walk because she was bored. She might be punished, But there was no need to limit herself to her room, and Hector agreed because her father would never deny that. Elodie would have left the Duke's lair long before Hector began his plans. Whether he was a traitor or not was none of her business. Still, she didn't know if she could sleep peacefully at night without knowing his intentions, and seeing her think so much, Hector himself felt that the rumors of her going mad were true. But the protagonist thought she could test him with a small trap, smiling to herself. When she asked if she could confide something that had been worrying her lately, Hector immediately agreed. Then she began by saying she was worried that her father was furious with her, not knowing how she could be in his good graces again. Hector asked what could have made him so angry, and the protagonist said he must have heard about the annulment request of her engagement. This made him question the reason for the request, and Elodie began to say that it would be just between the two of them, explaining in a whisper that she had actually become quite fond of the second prince. This shocked Hector, who widened his eyes at her. The protagonist felt it was an appropriate reaction, as she had essentially confessed to having a crush on the Duke's political enemy. Assuming Hector was linked to the second prince, he wouldn't waste time conveying what she had just told him. Born out of wedlock or not, she was still the Duke's daughter, and there couldn't be anything more enticing for their adversaries. Though Elodie smiled because she was full of venom for anyone who dared take a bite. With Hector's gasp of surprise, she whispered for him to stay silent, placing a finger in front of her lips, and he promised to take the secret to the grave. Then the protagonist asked Hector what would be the best way to calm her father's fury. He carefully responded that perhaps Elodie could simply refrain from doing anything to irritate him further. This drew a smile from the protagonist, who replied that it was indeed wise of him, and she would take that into account. Smiling as she realized the bait was cast, she hoped he would take it. The time had come much sooner than she had expected, all to reel him in. Later, Martha finished helping Elodie get dressed, looking at herself in the mirror and asking if she really looked that good. The maid joked that it wasn't a magic mirror, but of all the ladies at the ball, she would certainly be the most beautiful. Even though she was still being punished, it was Elodie's duty to participate in official events as a member of the Perdia house, such as the Emperor's birthday banquet that day. Thus, the protagonist took her carriage ride to the royal family's palace. Then, after walking a bit, she realized that standing there was none other than the first prince with his arms crossed. Feeling that intense gaze, Elodie became irritated. After all, it wasn't as if she was excited to accompany him either. Still, the protagonist approached and greeted him with a friendly smile. Silently, the prince continued to stare at her when asked if there was a problem. Turning his face to the other side, he denied that anything was happening. Elodie wondered if he was waiting for an apology for fainting in his company. In any case, Adami said they should leave soon and extended his hand to offer help to get into the carriage. This surprised her, responding that it was really kind of him, and finally extending her hand to take his hand, hoping the banquet could be a pleasure for both parties. Thus, they entered the grand party, where many well-dressed people were talking in the hall. At the ball, Adami said he should make a courtesy round now, and she replied it was fine and asked him to go ahead. She watched him release her arm and approach other nobles to talk. Now that the prince had finally left her alone, she realized it was indeed the perfect opportunity. Not far from the ballroom, a subtle meeting place that seemed innocent in its notoriety was where Elodie met Hector, just as she had predicted. That was indeed Hector Arold, the personal advisor to Duke Perdia, who secretly served the second prince, long before the novel, if her suspicions were correct. Meanwhile, a man told the prince that he could take care of things as per his instructions, but saw a small problem with it. But the man noticed that Adamir was looking the other way and even raised his hand to interrupt his words when he tried to apologize if he displeased him to the point of turning his face. This was because he was interested in the conversation between Elodie and Hector near the window, wondering why she was talking alone with him. Moreover, the way Elodie was smiling radiantly made him think about her previous words of having fallen in love and being embarrassed to admit it. He couldn't believe that the person the protagonist had fallen for was the very snake that was Hector. Seeing that absurd scene before his eyes, Adamir began to walk away from the other man. The second Prince Beltran gained a reputation as a notorious womanizer. Among all the young debutantes of Valencia, rumors had it that there was hardly a soul who hadn't been courted by the prince at least once. And as if nothing satisfied him, the prince was also well known in the pleasure district, where he was frequently seen enjoying the streets in a display of fury befitting his status. In other words, the second Prince Beltran was a true scoundrel. If Beltran's sweet whispers deceived Elodie into desiring an annulment, then Adamir would be a fool to accept that request. The first prince clenched his fists, thinking that although Elodie believed in his brother's lies, he wasn't cruel enough to let her suffer without extending a hand. It was his duty as a gentleman, but before he could do anything, he stopped walking. Meanwhile, Beltran smiled at the protagonist because he hoped to get to know her properly, as it seemed that Ishtar herself had blessed them that night. Elodie let out a small laugh, responding that she was delighted despite mentally feeling it was more like a curse. Beltran asked if she liked opera, feeling honored to accompany her one day, and she agreed that it could be some day. After that, they could even rent a restaurant for a private dinner and enjoy each other's company, and mentally she was cursing Beltran in various ways. The fact that Beltran approached her first could only mean that Hector had already confided everything she had told him earlier. Now that she was aware of the situation, Elodie had no interest in the second prince. The big problem was that Beltran himself was more interested in her than ever, making her wonder how he couldn't take the hint and leave her alone. Meanwhile, the prince thought it was very bold of Elodie to break the engagement because of him, wondering what his older brother would think of it, and that it would certainly be amusing to see the Duke's reaction as well. This brought a smile to his face, thinking that the timid flower that was Elodie was annoying the protagonist. Upon hearing him say that his brother was truly heartless, for he himself wouldn't leave such a beautiful lady alone at such a ball, Beltran approached the protagonist and asked what she thought, making her freeze in place. When he said he would give her the honor of sharing a dance with him, a voice interrupted the conversation, calling out for Elodie, and footsteps approached. As Duke Sylvester approached, he startled Beltran when he and the protagonist turned towards him. Sylvester assumed that the conversation was over, and since he and his daughter still had things to discuss, he would take her with him. Despite Beltran tensing up, Elodie turned and followed her father immediately, curious, because it was very rare for him to seek her out during a social event. But he held her firmly by the wrist and practically pulled her away from the second prince, surprising her, but also making her think it was a dream and pinch her own cheek. With the pain of pinching her cheek, Elodie realized it wasn't a dream. They went out to the balcony, where it was nighttime, and the protagonist tried to talk to her father, asking if there was something Sylvester wanted to tell her. After a moment, the Duke turned, calling her name, which made her nervous. Staring at his daughter, he said it would be good if she stayed away from the second prince. Elodie replied that she had no intention of doing otherwise, as Beltran started a conversation by chance, and she was just being polite in return. The Duke said that was great, as he had a tendency to be lecherous, and it was an open secret, so he suggested she stay away from Beltran at social events and ignore his letters. The protagonist agreed with every word her father said, asking him not to worry, though she froze and wondered if it was really concern. Hesitating, she asked if he was worried about her, just as the wind ruffled her hair. As he remained silent, Elodie realized his silence said it all, but she was surprised when he replied that perhaps he was. She asked again, trying to understand what he meant by that, and her father confirmed that he was worried, leaving her visibly shocked. Sylvester questioned how many times he needed to repeat it. Elodie couldn't tell by his expression if he was really a concerned father. Whether true or not, things would be different when he discovered she wasn't his blood daughter. He would certainly kill her without hesitation, which made the protagonist freeze in fear. So she asked her father if she could confide something to him, still appearing nervous. After Sylvester agreed, Elodie said that it might seem ridiculous, like a fantastical story she made up to get attention, but the truth was that he should be careful with his assistant, Hector. Every favor he did for the Perdia house would contribute to his own security, a kind of insurance. If the Duke could eliminate the traitors in his service, he could certainly help the protagonist in the future as well. Besides, this could be her own way of thanking the Duke for raising her. Meanwhile, inside the ball, surrounded by several ladies, were the Duke's sons, Yancy and Carl. Carl said it was indeed time for a doctor to check Elodie's head after that shameless display. The elder told him to speak lower while he enjoyed his drink, making the younger raise his voice, questioning why she would throw herself at the second prince like that, because no debutante would act that way in public. Yancy replied that it was the prince who threw himself in her path, not the other way around. But Carl complained because it made no difference, as it was clear that Elodie couldn't be let loose in society, potentially embarrassing everyone with her usual antics. Finally, the boy froze in fear when Yancy became so irritated that his glass shattered into pieces. He commented that he activated his blessing unintentionally due to stress, suggesting that Carl should keep his incessant complaints to himself. For the threatening Yancy, it would be a shame to erase anything else from existence unintentionally. Back at the ball, the protagonist sighed because she certainly didn't expect the Duke to save her from Prince Beltran's advances, but she could suppose that her work there was done for the day, and perhaps she should just return to the mansion. Suddenly, Adamir called her, asking if he could have the honor of sharing a dance with her, reminding her of the Crown Prince, whom she had completely forgotten until then. Elodie apologized, saying she was completely exhausted that night and wondered why everyone was acting so out of the ordinary all of a sudden. It wasn't as if any of them had cared about what she did or felt before. When the prince remained silent, the protagonist said she was actually about to go home that night. Still, the prince approached the protagonist, asking her to hold his hand, as there was something he wanted to discuss with her. This made her uncomfortable because yet another insistent prince was there, and he even questioned why she had that look of pure disgust. The protagonist laughed and held his hand, pretending not to know what he was talking about, and he said it really didn't matter. So, they returned to the ball, where they began dancing together, and the first prince asked if she had made the request to cancel the engagement, and Elodie agreed, wondering why he was asking the same thing again. However, she was surprised because he had to refuse her refusal, making her ask the reason for this decision. He replied that the engagement was quite useful, catching her completely by surprise, especially with the word useful, which irritated her. Then, after stopping the dance, Elodie stepped on the first prince's foot with a look of disdain, ignoring the pain and shock of what had just happened. She apologized with a fake smile for making such a mistake and asked if she'd hurt him, this time irritating Adamir, who replied that he literally felt nothing. Thus, 2 days passed in the blink of an eye after the emperor's birthday banquet ended. It was true that the engagement between Elodie and Adamir was for convenience, but the way he spoke, as if it were a tool, still enraged her, making her step on his foot multiple times. While reading, she thought it was indeed annoying that Adamir opposed the annulment so much and wondered if he didn't see that the breakup could benefit them both. Anyway, the protagonist thought she could stop asking for an annulment when he fell for Estelle later, until she widened her eyes in shock when the maid appeared running and shouting her name. Frightened, Elodie asked Martha what had happened, and she questioned if she had done it again. Confused, the protagonist asked what she was talking about, and Martha replied that she had been hearing Elodie mumbling all the time, asking for what other reason the Duchess would want to see her in her garden. Finally, Elodie understood that the Duchess was calling for her, waiting for her in the greenhouse right now. Elodie's first memory of Demis was not particularly pleasant. She was a sick girl crying because of a fever or some similar illness, and there was no one around to take care of her except the Duchess. Sitting at the edge of her bed, Demis looked at Elodie in silence while she cried. With an uninterested gaze, devoid of any emotion, it was as if she couldn't see any life in her. To this day, that memory haunts her, although Elodie is happy that she set aside her fear for the lucrative deal they had. As she went to meet the Duchess, the protagonist looked for her, confused because she couldn't see her anywhere, and wondered where she could be, hoping that Demis wouldn't mind if she looked around until she returned. Elodie's attention was stolen by some beautiful flowers nearby. Approaching because they were enchanting, she wanted to know what they were called. A voice warned her to be careful, as a centimeter more, and that little flower could tear her arm off up to the shoulder. Elodie jumped back, bumping into the Duchess. Looking surprised behind her at Demis, who had finally appeared, she was told that the Holcaria was a carnivorous plant, a rare species that feeds on human prey. It lures unsuspecting humans with its impressive features and intoxicating pollen, then devours them down to their bones. Demis advised Elodie to be careful, and she apologized because she didn't know. The Duchess agreed because it was obvious she didn't know, as the plant was recently discovered on an uninhabited island off the coast of the Kingdom of Devay. She stepped back, asking if Elodie would like to sit down, and the protagonist agreed while approaching the table where the Duchess had sat. The Duchess then served some iced tea to calm Elodie's nerves, and she thanked her because it was really thoughtful, thanking her and thinking she would certainly like to drink something cool after the scare she had. To Demise's surprise, she watched Elodie drink the cup of tea quickly, questioning if she was seeing an empty cup, surprising Elodie and asking back if she should have left some. After all, she just drank the entire cup of tea before she even realized it. In the end, it was Demise who offered the cup, not knowing why she was asking that. The Duchess clarified that her guests usually didn't drink the tea she served without looking twice first. Elodie understood because Demise was a poisoner by profession, imagining that people who recognized her only by reputation would suspect that. Not that Elodie doubted it, knowing her death would only occur 3 years from now, but it would be harder to escape if she revealed she knew more than she appeared to. So, the protagonist stammered that she must have been thirsty because of the unseasonal heat, and the Duchess questioned if it was to the point of abandoning her self-preservation. Elodie nervously mentioned the delicious fragrance, but her tea had no smell. This made her even more nervous because she didn't know what else to say to the Duchess, who looked at her confusedly, until she had an idea and said it was because Demise was her super reliable business partner. That's why she felt she impressed her with what she could do, guessing that her antidote was approved for sale, thinking that was the reason Demise wanted to see her. And if they were going to work together, she doubted she would poison her own partner. After a moment, the Duchess agreed that Elodie was right, placing her teacup down and praising her for being smarter than she appeared. But she questioned if that was a good reason to assume she was truly safe from her poison. Just to reassure her, Demise stated that she hadn't poisoned her tea but would find it prudent for Elodie to develop a more cautious stance. For now, she could praise her for her discernment, because if she had truly intended to poison her, she wouldn't have been so careless as to tamper with her tea while they were face to face. That's because she couldn't go very far in that line of work if she wasn't discreet, and besides, she could find more creative ways to assassinate someone. Her dark smile made Elodie tremble, agreeing while stammering. Demise said that, as she had guessed, the license was authorized for the antidote Elodie produced. The entire initial stock was put on the market for an advance payment, which was only a modest amount this time, given the small quantity they supplied. Still, that belonged to Elodie, and if she wished, she should check the entries and exits in the ledger. At that moment, a maid approached with a small, shiny chest that surprised the protagonist with the payment. The Duchess commented that she had another request to make, and Elodie agreed immediately, hearing the question of how long it might take to make another batch of antidotes and whether she would mind making an offer for the recipe. This surprised her a bit, but Elodie was reluctant to share it as it was a trade secret, which was a pity for the Duchess. She mentioned that she had a new selection of lethal toxins in their final stages and asked if Elodie thought she could create counteragents for them as well. The truth was that Elodie preferred not to do that, as she would feel immense pain during the process. To purify the poison, she first needed to drink the poison, and even with her blessing, she still suffered immensely from the excruciating effects of the poison. Elodie mentioned that she would like to discuss their secret deal with the Duchess and asked if she could trust her discretion on this matter. This made Demise question why she would consider an old poisonous snake ready to break her word, making the protagonist nervous as she tried to explain that it wasn't what she meant. Demise laughed a little and replied that there was nothing to worry about, as she gave her word and intended to keep it, no matter what. After all, they should be business partners, a statement that left the protagonist paralyzed on the spot. With her eyes shining, Elodie agreed that indeed they were. Even though the Duchess probably didn't mean anything by it, the protagonist replied that she couldn't have asked for a better person. As a Perdia in name only, with no real claim to the family lineage, the word "we" was as sweet as it was strange to her ears. On another day, walking through the corridors, the protagonist heard a voice saying to throw him in the underground cells. Outside, the Duke and several other guards with their swords pointed threatened a man on the ground who was trying to protest. This man was Hector, nervously promising to do nothing but serve faithfully with all his devotion to the family. Sylvester told him to watch his tongue, as there was evidence condemning him as the second prince's spy in their midst. This made Hector plead because it was a conspiracy. That treacherous prince wanted nothing more than to sow discord between them, and it was his dirty work. Elodie watched from a distance without getting involved, not expecting such good entertainment on her way back from the Duchess's garden. The Duke continued to threaten his assistant, who cried and begged for forgiveness upon seeing his sword close to his body, still asking to be spared and for mercy. Hearing this, she thought Hector might be a traitor, but she had no desire to see a defenseless man die, and she began to walk away. It didn't help that it seemed like a dark omen for her own future, and she decided she should return to the annex. Just as her father called her name, making her stop walking, she turned nervously in Sylvester's direction, who questioned why she looked so shocked, because people might suspect she was guilty. Elodie stammered that she hadn't done anything wrong, sweating coldly, making the Duke look at her intently. She swore on her life that she would never do anything like that. After that, he sheathed his sword and told his daughter to come closer, as he had something to say to her. He then turned to walk, and Elodie nervously followed him. They opened the door to a room, and the protagonist imagined they must be going straight to his office. But after opening the door, the Duke told her to enter first, and the girl agreed, not understanding why they entered the Duke's room, wondering what they were doing there. Sylvester removed his coat and threw it aside before sitting down, telling her to do the same. After sitting down, Elodie heard her father asking how she knew about Hector. She replied that she met him by chance in the mansion's corridor before the Emperor's birthday banquet. Although it was half a lie, it wasn't necessary for the Duke to know all the details. She said that when they met, Hector seemed to be living under a very peculiar misunderstanding. This caught the Duke's attention, especially when the protagonist said that he thought she was in love with the second prince. Hearing this made Elodie sweat even more because Sylvester was staring at her as if he was going to kill someone, and she stammered that she didn't want to believe it either. It was absurd to think she would have any affection for a man like Beltran. In any case, Elodie couldn't find the right moment to correct the situation and ended up being approached by Beltran at the banquet. The Duke was furious to the point of almost breaking the arm of his chair. The protagonist nervously said that since she felt something was wrong, she decided to warn her father. Finally, he sighed, crossing his arms, because that certainly explained everything. Elodie felt relieved that she had resolved the issue, almost thinking she would have a heart attack from all the pressure. Sylvester said that with all the worms living double lives under his roof, he intended to purge them once and for all, and told her not to leave her annex until it was safe. This made her think that things would be even worse if her father knew she herself was living a double life. Then, the Duke confessed that he wasn't so proud as to deny that it was Elodie who identified the traitor, and that's why he would grant her a reward. This excited her, as she never imagined her father would offer her a reward for being a whistleblower. Her fingers tightened on the fabric of her clothes, nervous because if she could, she would make him swear not to take her life under any circumstances. But she asked her father to grant her freedom again, even though it wasn't the right moment. Her father asked if that was all she could ask for, and it was obvious that it was what she wanted most, trying to appear as harmless as possible. This made him think before agreeing that she could have her freedom once more, making her mentally celebrate while she thanked him. But her happiness was interrupted when the Duke stated there would be a condition. Sylvester imagined she would be eager to leave the house when authorized to do so, and the protagonist agreed that she was indeed. He confirmed she could do so as long as her companion was also by her side. Therefore, she could choose between Yancy and Carl, shocking her even more, because she had to choose one of the two brothers. Questioning if she had no choice but to have one of her brothers go with her, the Duke insisted that it had to be so, because Prince Beltran could approach Elodie whenever he found it convenient, and a knight of the family wouldn't have the authority to bar his way. Elodie didn't know whom to choose, making her father suggest she could take both, and she quickly replied that she had made her choice, retracting immediately because one was more than enough. This made the Duke satisfied because she understood, and he asked who she preferred as her companion. Later, Carl asked why Elodie thought he would go anywhere with her when he was busy training in fencing. She crossed her arms and questioned if the Duke hadn't said anything, pointing at him and saying he would be her companion from now on. Carl widened his eyes, questioning if this was an attempt by their father to make a bad joke. Elodie denied it because Sylvester obviously had no humor and asked if he would refuse, making him agree because he would rather die than do that. She turned, saying she would go and tell the Duke about it, ready to cause some drama to convince young Carl, until he ran to hold the protagonist's hand, asking innocently if there was anything else she wanted to say. Finally, the boy commented that he would go with her, shouting that she had better not tell the Duke he had grumbled about it. Later, Elodie and Carl were walking along the city sidewalk side by side. The younger one complained that it was indeed a total waste of time, bringing a smile to the protagonist's face, thinking that Carl was the most stressed, and it was much easier to deal with him than with an enigma like Yancy. Her brother asked where Elodie's maid was, as this should be her duty. The protagonist said that Martha spent her time better with the other tasks she was entrusted with, and besides, she thought that while she was with Carl, she wouldn't need anyone else. Her response took Carl by surprise, who asked what she meant by that. Hearing that not everything she said had a double meaning, she thought that although Carl wasn't as strong as Yancy, he still had the Perdia's blessing of destruction. Carlot's blessing was the ability to destroy the earth. From the smallest cracks to literal chasms in the landscape, he had the power to create rifts in the ground at will. It was a destructive blessing suitable for large-scale battles, meaning it rarely had the chance to shine in those times of peace. Even so, Carl always seemed to value his blessing with great pride, even having an extraordinary talent for swordsmanship. It was said that his skills were on the same level as most adult knights in duels. Speaking well of him, Carl confirmed that she couldn't ask for a better bodyguard than him, making her think that although Elodie had some doubts about his intellect, she couldn't stress about it because of him. Leaving that aside, her brother asked where they were going, and the protagonist explained that the streets were filled with seamstress boutiques, so she wanted to visit each one. He questioned why she didn't just call the seamstresses to the mansion and still went there as if she were a peasant. Elodie explained that he would understand soon and asked if he had heard about Blancs aux Blancs because she was dying to try the chocolate fondant from that place, and so she asked her brother to bring some with a smile. Carl asked if she had brought him there just to buy an idiotic chocolate cake, and Elodie just told him to go quickly because there were other things to do. Again, he complained because he had heard that people waited in line for hours due to its popularity, and he would have to wait that long, while Elodie could have servants doing that for her. Meanwhile, the protagonist opened the shop door and replied that no one was forcing him and that she would hate for him to feel pressured. With that said, she asked what the alternative would be if their father found out about his disobedience, smiling as she asked Carl if he ever thought he would get away when disobeying a direct order from the Duke, worrying about how Sylvester might receive that news, clearly intimidating Carl. Elodie sighed, telling him that their father had destroyed a perfectly good armchair the other day just because he expressed himself poorly, and she shuddered at the thought of what else he could break. Still, she stated that he didn't need to worry, and she would make sure to speak well of him to the Duke, though she doubted her word had much weight with the Duke these days, with a smile that silenced Carl before he agreed, asking if it was just the chocolate fondant his sister wanted. She agreed with a broad smile, happy because convincing her brother was very easy. So, Carl entered Blancs aux Blancs, where several ladies watched him with interest, whispering that it wasn't a sight they saw every day, and they were grateful because they could see Carl, not knowing that he liked sweets too. They found it adorable that the rebellious second son of the Duke Perdia had a secret love for desserts, while he was completely embarrassed to make the order. The girls whispered, wondering if there was any reason for him to be waiting in line like them, though they were happy to see his face for even longer. Carl felt humiliated, and even the vendor was nervous to serve him when he heard him stammer the name of the chocolate fondant wrong. The vendor agreed to sell it, asking with a gentle smile how many he would like. Again, the girls were excited about how cute it was to see Carl buying chocolate, especially since he had probably never done anything like that alone before. They decided that at the next banquet, they could offer him all the desserts he hadn't tried yet. Furious, Carl ordered the vendor to pack the entire stock and send it to the Perdia mansion, taking one box for himself, and the vendor could only agree. Later, Carl returned, shouting for Elodie in the boutique, making a silver-haired girl look back in surprise. She received him while he apologized for the intrusion, but returned with the chocolate his sister had requested. He asked where Elodie was, and the girl said she had left some time ago, saying she had something to do. When he asked how long ago, she replied it had been almost 2 hours, scaring Carl. Meanwhile, the protagonist was walking alone, carrying her coat and shading her eyes from the sun, noticing how wonderful that day was, until she remembered she had left her parasol in the boutique, even though it was one of her favorites. It was a pity, but she couldn't go back now, not when she had just escaped Carl's watchful eyes. Now, Elodie thought her brother should have noticed her absence in the shop, but knowing how he was, it would take time before he reported her missing. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit failure so easily to the Duke, though she didn't imagine the Duke would eventually find out. She covered her hair with the cloak and walked through the forest, saying she could simply say she went to a nearby tea house to rest. The protagonist made her way to the tower beyond the forest, where several hooded people were gathered. Arriving at the place known as the Western Tower of the Mages, she was surprised because this was the first time she had seen it in person. She thought it would be fascinating to take a tour while she was there, but unfortunately, she didn't have much time to spare for now. Elodie could return to the tower once her business was concluded. She walked inside the tower towards a table where a man was sitting nearby. She politely asked the man for a moment of his time, calling his attention. He agreed, not very interested, asking how he could be of service without even looking up from the paper he was writing on. The girl said she was thinking of making an investment in a project of the tower, and he agreed that she could do so as long as she was an investor. But he was shocked upon hearing clearly what she said, and Elodie confirmed that she wanted to invest, questioning if there was any problem with that. In the blink of an eye, the protagonist was seated in a chair that appeared suddenly. The man said quite the opposite, apologizing for the deplorable welcome he had given her before. Smiling, he asked for her favorite tea to prepare right away with his magic, and Elodie just said she could drink whatever was available. Surprised by his drastic change in attitude at the mention of money, it was clear that capitalism was especially strong in that world. He asked which project she was thinking of investing in, as the tower was currently heavily involved in gold mining, which might pique her interest. While Elodie tried to pick up the teacup, she didn't object to investing in gold, but she had heard that she could invest in an individual mage as a patron. This made him smile even more, impressed by her knowledge, and he asked if there was a specific name in mind. His smile froze when the protagonist said she wanted to invest her entire budget in a mage named Elvie. The man stammered, suggesting that there were better products to invest in and asking if he could persuade her to reconsider her options. However, Elodie responded that it wasn't necessary because she had already made her decision before coming there. She said she would invest 8,000 larets, and she wanted every penny to go to the mage Elvie. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate his apprehension. He probably thought she was a fool for wanting to invest in a mage who didn't even have feathers in his hat. But he would never understand the real reason for her investment in mage Elvie and why she chose him. Her knowledge of the novel in which this world was created allowed her to know the future. For example, she knew when Elvo would invent an arcane artifact that would become immensely popular. All this to gain wealth beyond her imagination by using her convenient actions from the novel's plot. In other words, Elodie had a foolproof investment plan with guaranteed returns. Fortunately, Gail was a complete nerd when it came to world-building knowledge, so the novel had many details about it. The attendant agreed with the protagonist's decision and asked her to review the contract and sign it, and a paper flew towards her like a magical contract. Using Elodie's real name could create a trail of information for her pursuers to follow after she fled the mansion, so she decided on a pseudonym. She could use her nickname Lily as her first name, and she had already thought of a last name to use. The man said that once the contract was signed, he would check if everything was in order, and she agreed before handing the paper back to him. After checking, he confirmed that everything was in order and congratulated her because she was officially an investor in the Western Tower of Mages. He hoped her investment would bring good fortune, addressing her as Lady Lily Arcel. Later, the protagonist returned to the city, walking calmly with a satisfied smile on her face after everything she had accomplished at the Mage's Tower. Now that her money was in good hands, she no longer had to worry about funds and could start thinking about her other plans. The sales of the antidotes alone brought in more than enough coins, but she couldn't afford to be complacent, especially when there was no way to know how long the Duchess would keep a secret about her blessing and the antidotes. For now, Elodie decided she should hurry to meet the furious Carl, already imagining his words because she was sure her brother would make a big fuss when he found her. It was enough to give her a headache as she walked, but as she thought about it, someone was watching her from a distance. This man, upon seeing her, began to follow the protagonist, taking increasingly faster steps down the street. Approaching closer with each step, he quickened his pace until Elodie looked back over her shoulder towards the footsteps. When a hand grabbed her wrist and startled her so suddenly, it had an almost frightening air. The man finally found her and squeezed her wrist upon realizing he had spotted her after searching for so long. But she pulled her hand away and said he must have mistaken her for someone else, almost scared because she thought it was Carl, but it was a complete stranger who had approached her. He didn't seem like a scoundrel. He was actually quite attractive with his black hair and red eyes, but Elodie would certainly remember a face like his, and it was impossible that they had met before despite the man being perplexed by her response. This irritated her even more as she checked her wrist, worried because it hurt, and he could have broken it with the way he grabbed her. The man stated that she was precisely the one he was looking for. After all, she was Ga Yeol Yun. Those words made Elodie freeze and look at him again, asking who he was, totally shocked. She wondered how he knew that name, which no one else besides her should know, now paying more attention to him than before. But before she could hear an answer, a voice called her name, and she turned again to look the other way. She noticed it was her brother calling for her, searching among the people, still shouting her name among the women around. He couldn't have chosen a worse moment to find her, and Elodie realized she had to do something before Carl saw her. The black-haired man held her arms and leaned in close from behind the protagonist, whispering near her ear a promise that he would come for her soon. When the protagonist turned, scared and confused, she asked what exactly he meant by that, but the man who had been behind her had disappeared quickly, leaving nothing behind her. He vanished completely from her field of vision, which was a complete surprise for Elodie, who still wondered who that mysterious man was who appeared and left so quickly. After hearing the words of the unknown man promising that he would come for her soon, she turned around, surprised, not understanding anything about what just happened. In some way, Elodie felt as if she had been enchanted. It was only a brief encounter, yet it seemed as if an eternity had passed in a single moment. Suddenly, a voice called her name, and Carl grabbed her arm, shouting and asking if she had any idea how dangerous it was to walk around without guards. The protagonist recoiled because he was gripping her too tightly, causing pain in her shoulder without understanding what had happened to him so suddenly. Her brother scolded her, saying she was a fool if she thought she was safe in those streets alone in this manner. But Elodie brushed off his hand, asking if he even cared, as whatever misfortune happened to her, that had nothing to do with him. This made him stop in shock, and Elodie wondered if he had suddenly developed a conscience for his actions overnight. He, more than anyone else, had no right to look at her that way. It was absurd. No one wanted her gone more than Carl himself right from the start. In the mansion, the maids would gossip about how that girl was nothing short of an abomination. She was completely insensitive, just like her mother. They only hoped she wouldn't claim the Perdia name, as she was born out of wedlock to the Duke, and obviously, Carl would hear all those rumors about his half-sister. Certainly, they said she wasn't a Perdia without a blessing to declare it. In any case, they blamed her for the Duke's recent neglect of his duties. After hearing all of this, Carl clenched his fists, realizing that they were calling Elodie a bastard, and wondered if this was why his parents didn't get along. It was all because of his sister, so he began mistreating her, pushing her even when Elodie complained that it was really mean of him. The maids tried to calm him, saying he shouldn't be there, and that they would take him to the main house, but he accused his sister of being a filthy child of sin. She tried to respond that she wasn't filthy because she bathed every day, but he yelled that she was impure by blood. It was all her fault, and she was the reason their parents hated each other. Carl screamed that no one wanted her in that house. In fact, he wished she would disappear forever. In the present, back from those memories, Elodie knew it was impossible for him to genuinely care about her. She walked past him, saying that if Carl was worried about their father, he didn't need to think about it at all because she didn't intend to mention any of this to him. Carl remained silent as Elodie thought that she was convinced the past wouldn't bother her anymore, but she knew it was inevitable for trauma to resurface when least expected. Either way, she had more urgent matters to worry about now, like the man with black hair and red eyes who suddenly appeared. He must know something about her past life, so she needed to find a way to talk to him because she had many questions to ask. She then told Carl they should return now. Back at the mansion, Martha was shocked by the number of gifts in her room, and Elodie imagined they were all desserts she could indulge in until the end. The protagonist could assure that she was not in the mood for games now, thinking she should have made it clear that just one box would have been enough. But it was obvious that the rich idiot Carl had bought all the chocolate fondants under the Perdia house name excessively. With that, Elodie suggested that her maid take them, as she could share them with her staff at the guest house. Martha got excited and asked if she really could. It was very generous of her to make such a decision. Meanwhile, Elodie was still thinking about the man with red eyes, remembering that he called her Ga Yul Yun, her original name for sure. It made her wonder what exactly he knew about her and who he was to begin with. He seemed like a noble from the way he carried himself with such grace. So, Elodie asked Martha if she knew any gentleman around 20 years old with black hair and red eyes, and she replied by asking if he was a handsome young man. To which the protagonist thought and answered that he was exceptionally handsome, which made the maid deny it, as she didn't know anyone like that. Surprised, Elodie realized that she hadn't even considered the possibility, but Martha firmly insisted that she had no idea who it could be. With that, the protagonist said that she was clear enough and could now withdraw, thinking that if Martha didn't know, then maybe that young man wasn't truly a noble. He said he would come to her at the right time, but she couldn't afford to wait for that moment. And then she noticed an imperial palace letter on the table. Martha mumbled, realizing she had forgotten to mention it to Elodie earlier, explaining that it arrived that morning, but she got distracted. Out of all the things that could be neglected, this was one of the least that should happen. So Elodie opened the letter and asked for paper and a pen because she had to write her response to the prince. Meanwhile, Yancy asked if the guard had been deceived, and he agreed and apologized to the man, realizing it was at the mage's tower. It was curious to Yancy that Elodie would have business inside that tower to begin with, but what puzzled him even more was that the man they were investigating had no imaginable connection with Elodie, at least as far as he knew. Yancy questioned if he had heard anything about the man's conversation with his sister, only to receive a negative response from the guard again, making the brother think that Elodie had certainly changed a lot recently. She wasn't just instrumental in uncovering the collusion between her father's advisor and the second prince, but she had also been joining her mother for tea, when before she barely spoke to her. As for her father, before, the Duke had no interest in Elodie, but now he had assigned Carl to protect her like a guard dog. Something peculiar was happening there. However, Yancy himself still couldn't define what it was. As he pondered, he picked a flower petal that had fallen on his hair and saw his glove disintegrating along with it. Realizing that once again it was his unruly blessing acting up, the guard beside him offered to bring him a new pair of gloves, but Yancy replied that it wasn't necessary because it was time to head back inside, but they should still keep an eye on Elodie until otherwise ordered. Meanwhile, the protagonist was a bit frustrated because she had received another message from the prince, even after replying that she didn't intend to attend the dinner. When Elodie opened the letter to read it, she quickly became furious and screamed, wondering why no one would leave her in peace. In the reception room, Adamir apologized for showing up unannounced. The news that her health was still poor had made him worried enough to insist on paying a visit, and he hoped her condition wasn't as bad as before. With a smile, Elodie thanked him, saying she had improved a lot thanks to the prince. In truth, she could hardly believe he had come right to her door suddenly, all because she had declined a few invitations. Maybe he thought the privilege of a boy with a pretty face allowed him to do whatever he wanted without worrying about the consequences, but in the end, he managed to do exactly that, and there he was. Life was truly unfair. But Adamir seemed happy to see that the protagonist looked to have more color in her cheeks, given her good health, so he saw no reason why she shouldn't attend. Elodie was confused about what exactly he was referring to, and he replied that he was obviously talking about that evening's dinner, catching her off guard. As Adamir explained that the Duke himself invited him, and that his entire family would be present, he believed she should attend as well, unless she decided to fake another illness. Elodie's heart nearly stopped in shock as he continued, saying that there was still some time until dusk, and that should be enough for her to get ready. But the protagonist certainly didn't want to be present at that party. At the family meal, Elodie ended up attending against her will, feeling as if she could choke on every bite. Then the Duke began to speak, saying that he heard news from House Angelos that they intended to begin full-scale production of military supplies soon. Yancy agreed, saying he had heard the same and assumed that their recent negotiations with the Southern Mage Tower had already led them to manufacture magical implements. In addition, he had been told that they were acquiring the rights to all the Magicite mines they could find for the production of enchanted armor. The protagonist remembered that House Angelos was one of the 4 great houses whose blessing was the blessing of restoration, and its leader was Rodrigo Angelos. He He was a man who chose to dedicate his life solely to maximizing the wealth and glory of his family. He was relentless in his ultimate goal of subjugating all other noble houses under the banner of House Angelos. And the most prominent obstacle to his ambitions was none other than Duke Sylvester Perdia. Sylvester said he didn't foresee any threat to them in this regard, though he could imagine it representing an obstacle to material supplies in the long run. At that moment, Dennis suggested that they could buy their own mines because it would help secure a supply line while they could continue their operations. But the prince interrupted, warning that it might not be possible because House Angelos had anticipated them. Their claim over the vast majority of the Magicite mines was practically a done deal, and challenging their market dominance now would be a fruitless effort. Elodie thought that he wasn't entirely wrong in saying it would all be in vain. With or without the mines, the downfall of House Angelos was set in Magicite stone. It was a great and brutal fall, another common victory for House Perdia. It was a high-level game that couldn't be lost. Sometimes, knowing the future was amusing to Elodie. House Perdia might face turbulent waters for a while, but in the end, Yancy would take care of everything. Suddenly, the Duke called the protagonist, making her stop eating to listen, a bit worried because he had certainly caught her off guard. He said he would like to hear her opinion on that matter, genuinely surprising her this time. She thought it was strange to hear him say that, as he should have known that she had nothing to contribute to such a topic, almost worried that he could read her mind. It was when Yancy intervened, stating that Elodie wouldn't want to discuss such a heavy subject at the dinner table, but the Duke glared at him irritably because he hadn't asked for Yancy to speak. Faced with this reprimand, the eldest son stepped back and apologized for it, and Sylvester said that Elodie could share her opinion freely. Despite sweating nervously, she thought that rather than showing her ignorance, maybe it would be better to score some points with the Duke on this issue. Not that she didn't have sympathy for Yancy, but she had to prioritize her own survival. So Elodie said that she believed there was another way, which surprised Adamir as the Duke asked her to explain. She stated that House Angelos had bought almost all the mines in the Empire, essentially achieving a monopoly. They could be one of the founding houses of Valentia, but such a vast enterprise must have drained their coffers, and if they were in the business of monopoly, she suggested they should do the same. Carl asked if she was even listening, because she herself had said that House Angelos had most of the mines in their pockets. Elodie continued to explain that she wasn't referring to the Magicite mines, as Magicite stones weren't the only materials needed for manufacturing military equipment. It was simple, they just had to buy up all the other necessary materials. Not long ago, House Angelos had entered the weapons sector, so she doubted that they had many suppliers for anything other than Magicite yet. With time, they would have no choice but to make a deal with House Perdia, and at that moment, the materials could be sold to them at a very high profit margin. Everyone at the table was shocked by her words, and the Duke approved of Elodie with a nod of his head. Demis praised her for her wise comment, and the protagonist thanked him, thinking that in truth, it was originally Yancy's idea, just stolen from the novel as if it had belonged to her from the start. But she couldn't help feeling thrilled, because that must be how intelligent people felt all the time. Beside her, the prince wondered if the Duke's daughter had always been such a shrewd woman. One might think she was a completely different person from what she used to be. All those suspicious potions he saw in her room, not to mention the strange unrest in her own home, made Adamir wonder what she was hiding. A little later, Rodrigo was raging in his office, shouting and asking how it was possible that they no longer had any supply network left. But it wasn't just that. House Perdia had also bought all the mines in the Bruman region, and now they had no one else to deal with except them. Rodrigo thought it was obviously a trap. If that Down Duke had a monopoly over the remaining materials, he would pay dearly for the privilege of negotiating with him. That's why he knew they had no choice but for their company to give up, undoubtedly frustrated by Yancy, until one of the staff corrected him, stating that according to the informant, the idea hadn't come from his first son Yancy, but from his daughter Elodie. This left Rodrigo shocked, asking if he was sure about that, as he had thought she was nothing more than a useless love child without even a blessing. At the very least, it seemed that she had inherited the Perdia talent for scheming, and Rodrigo thought they should find a way to cut that problem at its root eventually. Later, the news spread saying that the Angelos house announced its sudden withdrawal from the arms trade, and the Magicite mines were up for sale without buyers. Elodie could bet that the greedy Rodrigo must be furious, But she was glad because, in this way, a plot point that would have been resolved much later in the original story managed to conclude quickly based on her knowledge of future events. It wasn't ideal for Elodie to steal Yancey's idea, but there was nothing that could be done now. She had to take care of herself, but more importantly, something felt off as she wondered why there were fewer potion bottles than before. Considering that she might have miscounted when suddenly a person knocked on the door and a staff member came in, reporting that the Duke was summoning her for a matter concerning the Angelos house, leaving Elodie slightly nervous because it seemed that the creation of antidotes would have to wait. After reading those headlines, Sylvester was surprised because it spread so quickly in the news, and the journalists did an excellent job. The protagonist smiled nervously, agreeing and thinking that those headlines were most likely prepared by the Duke himself, even though she hoped Yancey and Carl were also there to participate in that discussion. She considered that this case was their responsibility from the beginning, but she was alone. Elodie asked if her father had called for her, and he agreed, asking if it was a problem, which made her stammer and shake her head in denial. This made Sylvester smile, asking her to calm down because he had called her there to reward her for her help. He believed that this was the second time he had benefited from her wise advice recently. This drew a nervous smile from Elodie as she responded that she was flattered. It had just been a lucky guess, but it was unlucky for Yancey because she knew all the spoilers of the story. However, the Duke stated that there was nothing lucky about it, making her tense because she may have been too self-deprecating. No wonder Sylvester was suspicious, as she never showed interest in family business before. But if she hadn't gotten involved at that moment, she would have only disappointed the Duke, as she always did. It was better this way, but Elodie still felt something strange about his sudden interest. First, Sylvester called her for matters that usually didn't concern her, and then he made one of his precious sons accompany her wherever she went. None of his actions were typical of him. After all those years, he couldn't bear to see her and banished her to the guest house. It was then that she said she would like to ask him something. Wanting to know why the Duke sought her opinion at that moment, after all, he never cared about her, which made the Duke freeze at the question. Elodie couldn't remember a single time when he asked how she felt since the day she was born, but her father responded that it was simply because the woman she was now seemed capable of rising to the occasion. Elodie wondered if he was comparing her to the arrogant brat she used to be, or if he noticed something more. The Duke stated that it was undeniable that she had changed a lot recently, and to be clear, maybe he never showed it, but it was entirely incorrect to say that he never cared about her. As she should know, he generally behaved more harshly than he intended. If he kept his distance, it was only to avoid frightening her. There was never a moment when he didn't care about her, but Elodie couldn't stop thinking that she shouldn't believe those affectionate words. Because the moment he found out she wasn't even his legitimate daughter, he would kill her with his sword without hesitation, and she hesitated to approach Sylvester even when he gestured for it. Still, Elodie thought that if she could express her true wish just this once, maybe she could be at peace for now. The Duke asked her to tell him what would be an appropriate reward, and he would grant her anything within his power. So, Elodie said that she would like to hear him praise her. She wanted to feel loved, even if just for a brief moment. Reaching out, Sylvester gently patted his daughter's head and praised her, saying she did well and that he was proud of Elodie. When she left her father's office, she passed by Carl, who asked what she thought she was doing outside the house's boundaries, but Elodie ignored him and quickly walked past. He complained because she walked past him without acknowledgement, unwilling to allow her to treat him as if he were invisible, and he grabbed her arm, making Elodie say it hurt, asking him to let go. Leave, but he noticed that her eyes were red, asking why she was crying, if it was because her father had punished her or what she had done that time. Irritated by the flood of questions, Elodie responded that it was none of his business, telling him to go back to minding his own life as he always did. He stammered something nervously until finally shouting that if she thought he was asking because he cared, she must be crazy because he only worried about the shame she would bring to the Perdia house if anyone saw her like that. He didn't care at all if she was the cause of the family's indecent rumors. Still, Elodie thought that was exactly the type of thing Carl's character would say, only listening to him yell that she'd better not be wandering aimlessly at night and ordering her to go back to her room, because she shouldn't have forgotten what day it was, and it took Elodie a moment to remember that it was a crucial night. The night of the lunar eclipse, once every 3 years, when the moon was devoured by darkness, and on that night, Yancey would completely lose his control. To Deprived of celestial light, the realm of mortals was swallowed by the abyssal aura of Valhalla, the goddess of the underworld, forcing the imperial house and the four great houses to lose control over Ishtar's blessings. Not that it affected all houses the same way, although Elodie's purification blessing had little to do with the frenzy of the lunar eclipse. The destructive blessings of the Perdia house were a completely different matter. After all, on that day it would be 3 years since he literally blew off the mansion's roof. At the time, even Martha cried desperately because they thought the guest house was safe, but it quickly crumbled into pieces. As Carl used his powers uncontrollably, he almost left the entire property in ruins in a short amount of time. In the original novel, Carl almost managed to keep control of his blessing, but the problem was that something would interfere, and it didn't take long for the protagonist to find her brother Yancy in the garden, fallen to his knees that night just as she expected him to be from the beginning. Although Yancy was regarded by everyone around him as being able to handle his blessing, his real eradication control was actually weaker than it seemed. Every night of the lunar eclipse, he would hide in his mother's garden and suffer through the pain alone, so when Elodie found him, he was completely taken by surprise. 6 years ago, in her childish ignorance, Elodie had no idea how dangerous it was to wander around the property on the night of the eclipse and accidentally found him in the garden. At that time, Yancy yelled at her to go away and leave him alone, scaring Elodie and making her run away, stammering an apology. She turned and fled in fear and shame, but this time things would be different, and Elodie approached her brother Yancy, saying that she couldn't see well in the dark, but wanted to know he was feeling all right. Without a doubt, it was Estelle who should have shone in this hour of Yancy's need, like a dazzling ray of sunlight, consoling him in her warm embrace. She marked all the important points as a female protagonist, but Elodie intended to steal the spotlight from that girl right now. Yancy ordered his sister to leave, sweating profusely, while Elodie recalled a passage saying that Estelle hugged Yancy and patted his back. At any moment, she could have fallen victim to Yancy's deadly blessing. The novel said it was Estelle's selflessness that finally opened his heart, and if that was all that was needed, then Elodie began doing exactly that, comforting her brother by saying there was nothing to fear, wondering what difference it would make for him to be in her arms instead of Estelle's, which made Yancy sigh after a moment and again ask her to leave, saying that he wished she would disappear, and Elodie laughed, replying that everything would happen in due time and soon she would be far away from him. But in reality, she ended up staying so long that she didn't even know how much longer she should remain there. Surely, not even Estelle could lend her shoulder for an entire night, until suddenly Yancy woke up and looked at her in confusion, and Elodie stammered, asking how he was feeling, stepping back a little. To which he questioned what she was doing there, catching her by surprise when she responded that he didn't seem to remember that she was just taking a walk and stumbled upon him. Elodie didn't expect him to forget everything, but even feeling a bit guilty, she agreed that nothing else happened, and that was all there was to it. And she wondered if it was completely useless to try and help Yancy because she wasn't the protagonist of the novel, again asking if he was really not in pain. Nodding, he agreed that he was fine, and that Elodie could leave now. He didn't need her pity, he could take care of himself alone. A bit confused, the protagonist stood up, responding that it was a relief to hear that, even though he didn't seem fine at all. It wasn't as if she was welcome there anymore, so there was nothing else to be done. So, Elodie agreed that she would withdraw and leave him in peace, turning to walk away while Yancy watched her leaving, suddenly realizing that both in the past and now, it was always the same Elodie who came to console him. When dawn arrived at the Perdia mansion, the daylight revealed that there were no signs of destruction or any unpleasant incidents, and the staff also returned to the property, coming out from the shelter where they hid during all lunar eclipse nights. Everything went back to normal as it should, except for Yancy, who kept following her, asking if she was feeling all right, and Elodie repeatedly nodded. She wouldn't argue with the fact that he was grateful for her kindness the previous night, but she thought he didn't remember anything. Suddenly, there he was smiling at her, making her wonder what exactly Yancy was thinking. He kept following her and talking to her to the point where it almost started to irritate her, and she tried to disguise it by asking if he shouldn't be busy with his duties now. Not understanding his sudden display of affection, which made Yancy smile because she seemed worried about him, thinking it was kind of her. Elodie shivered as he placed a hand on her shoulder, slowly stepping back with an awkward laugh as she agreed that she was concerned about her brother and she would hate to distract him from his work. Even so, he insisted that she could save that pretense for later, and Elodie realized that he obviously remembered everything he did the previous night. Without a doubt, his intentions were to test her, waiting for the right moment to be sure that her lips would remain sealed about what happened. With that, Yancy withdrew his hand from her shoulder, saying there was something else she could do for him, starting by giving him the hand, which almost startled her as she asked why. Not understanding if he suddenly wanted to erase her from existence with his own blessing, but he grabbed her wrist anyway. Realizing that, just as she suspected, something clicked in his mind, which left Elodie worried about what exactly he was thinking. Until Carl appeared, asking what was going on, shocking Elodie, because the chances of the two of them showing up at the guest house at the same time were too rare. Noticing that she was in a complicated situation, Carl said that he just wanted to let her know that their mother wanted to speak with Elodie, which made Yancy say he didn't know Carl was their mother's messenger now, and Carl grumbled that he just happened to find her in the hallway. The protagonist thought that if someone could see them now, they would be amazed at how gentle and caring they seemed as siblings, but little would they know that none of them wanted to be anywhere near each other. So Elodie walked past them, saying that they could spare themselves the trouble and have the servants deliver the messages. After all, there was no love between them, and she was sure they had more important things to do now than to come all the way to the guest house. Then she bid them farewell because she had to meet with their mother, thinking that the less they saw each other, the better. In the greenhouse, Demis received the protagonist with a smile, and Elodie approached, asking if she would like to discuss the antidotes. The Duchess agreed that it was partly about that, though she didn't see any reason to rush, and the protagonist sat down, not understanding why she would be having a conversation with Demis unless it was to talk business. Suddenly, Elodie asked Demis if she had given her 11 types of antidotes to develop, and Demis replied that she had certainly given her 12, shocking Elodie, who nervously said that one of them had disappeared, and Demis asked if perhaps a maid misplaced it by accident, to which the protagonist denied again, apologizing because it was her mistake. The Duchess responded that it was all right, wondering who would be foolish enough to try and take a poison hidden away from the Perdia mansion of all places. If some insignificant thief stole it just because it looked shiny and expensive, then they would pay a very high price. Whether by drinking and succumbing to the poison or trying to sell it on the black market and inevitably getting caught, further worrying Elodie with the thought. Still, either result would amuse her stepmother, and Elodie felt it was terrifying to hear such words from a woman like her. For now, they should find out which poison had gone missing and have the maid pass the information so that a new sample could be sent, and Elodie thanked her, promising that she would send the antidotes as soon as they were all ready. She thought Demis would be furious to know she lost one of her precious toxins, but that didn't seem to be the case. Suddenly, Demis mentioned that she heard Carl and Yancy hadn't been leaving her alone lately, and Elodie almost spat out her tea, choking and worrying her stepmother, who wanted to know if it was a sensitive matter. But Elodie replied that it wasn't the case, certainly nothing for her to be concerned about, promising that she would do her best not to disturb her brothers. She wouldn't bother Carl except on the rare occasions when she needed to go out, and she stammered, excusing herself because she wanted to start working on the antidotes right away, practically running out of the greenhouse while Demis still watched, thinking that for now, she should just observe Elodie a little longer. Meanwhile, Prince Adamir received a report that what Elodie had in her room was poison, asking what kind it was and its effects when ingested. It seemed to be a creation of Duchess Demis Perdia, a skilled poison expert. They said a single drop could destroy the respiratory organs of its victims, and with an entire vial, it would cause death in just a few seconds. This made him think that he had good reasons to suspect something unusual when he took a vial from Elodie's room, but he never expected it to be a lethal poison. And he wondered why the Duke's daughter would have that in her possession and, moreover, keep it openly on her desk. The work was too amateurish to speculate that it was an attempt by the Duchess to take Elodie's life. He doubted she was the type to leave traces. While considering other possibilities, he recalled the cuts on Elodie's arms and started to consider a different answer for those questions. On another day, Elodie was taking a carriage trip when Carl said that she could show more gratitude because he could be dedicating his precious time to his training. The protagonist smiled, agreeing and suggesting that maybe she should ask for Yancy to be by her side from now on, even though she knew the Duke would be disappointed to hear about his son's negligence in the duty he should have been fulfilling. This made him quickly try to correct the situation, saying that he couldn't allow her to bother their father with such nonsense, even though Elodie certainly wasn't enduring his complaints for fun. Anyway, Carl asked where she was dragging him this time, and she replied that it was none of his business. However, he insisted because a bodyguard should at least have some idea of where his master was going, especially when the protagonist had a habit of sneaking away. And once again, Elodie responded that it was none of his business. This made him shout because she continued acting like a brat, and she said there was no need to worry, promising she didn't plan to run away, at least not until they reached the location. But since he was so curious, she told him they were going to visit the South Tower of the Mages, until she noticed there was a terrible commotion outside. That was when the carriage suddenly jerked and Elodie hit the side, feeling sore and noticing that Carl stood up, telling her to stay quiet and in place until he said it was safe outside. Drawing his sword and stepping out, ignoring Elodie's calls to know what was happening and to wait. Outside, she heard the sounds of swords clashing and covered her ears, curling up on the seat, wondering if they were being attacked by bandits, barely able to move out of fear. That day's outing was supposed to be a trip to the South Tower of the Mages. Elodie had planned to trick Carl into getting some Magitech trinkets and secretly make another investment to secure her assets after her initial investment in the Western Tower. But suddenly, they ended up in this situation. When it got quiet outside, the protagonist wondered if it was over, trying to see if Carl hadn't been hurt because he still hadn't said anything. To her shock, Elodie realized that her brother, the legitimate Carlot Perdia, had suddenly been forced to his knees by some opponent. When a bandit raised his sword to strike him from behind, the protagonist screamed for her brother and threw a vial of colorful liquid at the man's head to save Carl. Rushing to help Carl get back on his feet, he reminded her that she should have stayed inside the carriage in silence, but he couldn't move properly in his current state. Elodie felt relieved because she reacted just in time. The potion she used against the bandit wasn't lethal, but the smell was enough to incapacitate, which should buy them enough time. To escape, she helped her brother back to the carriage, commenting that after all his arrogance about being the legitimate son of their father, maybe this would teach him a little humility. Carl responded that she shouldn't mock him like that because things would have been different without those men's anti-blessing Magitech. Elodie scolded him because he intended to fight to the death over mere pride. Then she climbed onto the horse and told him to hurry and do the same. He said he was injured and it would be better for her to leave alone, making Elodie complain that he was too stubborn and wouldn't get very far without her by his side. So she told him to get on already if he was tired of self-pity, and Carl had no choice but to mount the horse as she said. Even so, Carl asked if she even knew how to handle a horse, and Elodie grew frustrated because he continued to irritate her even after everything. The horse began galloping away from the carriage, and she grew worried upon hearing the shouts of the bandits who were starting to chase them, even though she thought the toxins would keep those men at bay for a longer time. If she had known this could happen, she wouldn't have neglected her horseback riding lessons. It was ironic. Even after all her efforts to survive, this kind of thing had to happen. But Elodie had no intention of dying in vain like this. She wouldn't let her story end there, even when she found herself facing a cliff with her horse, and the bandits quickly caught up to them, ready to kill them both. It was at moments like these that she wished her blessing would be useful against bandits, but it was Carl who dismounted from the horse, bleeding, to fight and protect Elodie, which worried her immediately. But it was he who shouted at the protagonist to duck, but she couldn't react in time and slipped off the horse, starting to fall and worrying because there was only a sheer drop beside her, seeing Carl starting to shout for her too. For some reason, her mind flashed back to her past as she fell, remembering young Carl telling her not to touch him because it made his skin crawl. And now he was reaching out, trying to save his sister's life as she plummeted alone from that great height. In the past, Carl used to call her a filthy child of sin, disgusted by her and shouting that he didn't want her in his home, that he didn't want her to touch him. Now, when he saw Elodie fall from the cliff, Carl fell to his knees, staring at his own hands, wondering why she hadn't grabbed his hand when he asked. Was it because she preferred to die rather than owe him her life? Wondering if her hatred for him was so deep that she would rather fall than hold his hand. And even Elodie wondered if this was how she would meet her end. It seemed like everything was in vain in the end. Had it always been pointless to rebel against fate? She wasn't ready to face the beyond now, but suddenly, When she least expected it, she ended up falling into the arms of a man with black hair and red eyes who seemed familiar. He was the man who spoke about her past life, and although Elodie wanted to ask him questions, the man said she should rest now, and she lost consciousness. When he returned to report what happened to Sylvester, Carl bowed deeply, begging for his father's forgiveness because it was entirely his fault. Sylvester asked where Elodie was, and Carl explained that she fell from a cliff on the way to the South Tower of the Mages, on the outskirts of the capital, so the Duke ordered everyone to get into position to find his daughter. They shouldn't spare any effort and resort to all necessary means, reporting any clues they found immediately. Meanwhile, Carl should stay there and receive treatment for his injuries, and even as he insisted that he could lead the search personally, Demis intervened, asking him to stop because he had been poisoned and needed to rest now. Yancy added that despite Carl claiming to be a guard, he probably had no idea what his indiscretion had cost them, and Demis told him to stop it for now. For the time being, they should leave the search for Elodie to the Duke. She would personally take care of her son for now, and Sylvester continued by saying that he had never suggested that Carl couldn't join the search team once he was fully recovered. He didn't intend to risk the lives of his children so that they would lose their lives over their injuries and hinder the rest of the investigation, which made Carl shrink back and agree. Meanwhile, Elodie woke up in a wooden cabin, wondering where she was, feeling pain in her shoulder even though she believed everything was over for her. That familiar man had saved her. It was definitely him without a doubt. To think that among so many people, the one who saved her life was like a knight in shining armor. But Elodie wondered if there was a specific reason for his kindness. Whatever it might be, she knew there was no guarantee that she would be safe there. For now, she had to find a way to return to the mansion and stood up to leave that room until the man himself opened the door and they saw each other. Both froze as they looked at each other, remaining silent until Elodie asked if they should just stay like that. He apologized upon realizing that he was in shock. Worried because he thought she must still be injured, he asked if it would be all right to tend to her wounds, and Elodie, gripping her arm, agreed. For now, it would be best to accept that man's help, even though his motives were still unclear. At least his attitude seemed favorable. He invited her to sit down, mentioning that he would need to tear the sleeve of her dress, which he did to treat the wound on her skin. While he worked, Elodie asked if, by any chance, he was a magic practitioner, and he denied it. Then she inquired if he was a descendant of one of the great houses, and once again he denied, regretting that he was not. It didn't seem like he was lying, but it was hard to believe because he had such a noble appearance. So, disguising her embarrassment, she asked him to at least tell her his name since she didn't know how to address him. The man introduced himself as Ryan, saying that for now, she could call him that if it pleased her. At that, Elodie asked Ryan about when he called her Gael Yun when they first met, wanting to know what made him call her that. He remained silent for a moment before saying that he had heard it in a very peculiar dream, a dream of another world far away from theirs, amidst the endless cycle of his visions. During his sleep, that was when he met her for the first time, shocking Elodie because he had seen Gael Yun. In truth, Ryan knew it was Elodie at first sight, for the Gael Yun from his visions was identical to her in the flesh from his perspective. Elodie asked if that was the whole truth, if it was just that, and he agreed, knowing it sounded strange, though the protagonist's own story seemed strange in its own way. But she couldn't remember any character in the novel named Ryan, making her wonder if he had even told her his real name. However, questioning him further didn't mean Ryan would be more honest. Whatever his reason for approaching her, he didn't seem like a threat, and even Ishtar knew that there were more pressing concerns at the moment. This gave her a terrible headache, and finally, she asked what kind of place they were in now. Ryan explained that it was his humble abode, to which Elodie asked if he had seen anyone else when she fell from the cliff. He replied that he couldn't say what happened at the top of the cliff, but knew that the entire Perdia house was scouring the region looking for her, which surprised her, even though she was sure they would be glad that the parasite of the Perdia house had disappeared. The thought that all of them were putting in so much effort to find her caught her off guard. Still, Elodie had no intention of leaving the nest so soon, so she should be grateful that they were looking for her at all. Yet something worried her, and she stared at Ryan in silence for a long moment before asking how long she had been unconscious. He froze before touching her again, withdrawing his hand and stammering that it had been around half a day, shocking Elodie because she had been unconscious for much longer than she thought. The protagonist then stood up, saying that she needed to return to the Perdia mansion right away, asking him to accompany her. Meanwhile, in Sylvester's office, he asked Galen if there had been any results from the search, and he apologized, regretting to inform him that they still hadn't discovered anything about whom the bandits served. But it didn't seem like they were common people, assassins who intended to take Elodie's life from the beginning, which enraged the Duke, as Galen explained that, according to Karl, while he fought the assassins, the criminals seemed persistent in trying to target Elodie. Upon hearing this, Yancey said that they should spare no effort in finding out immediately who they served, but Sylvester interrupted him, replying that not yet, because before that, it was crucial to rescue Elodie first. That's why they should set out right away, during the night, to try to return to the place where everything had happened. Suddenly, a staff member burst into the office, shouting for the Duke to report that Elodie had returned safe and sound. The protagonist felt happy to have returned to the Perdia mansion with Ryan's help, but she certainly didn't need such a gathering in her room. She was ordered to stay at home for a week while resting, which was obviously a punishment that Elodie couldn't deny. Demis asked if she was hurt anywhere else, and Elodie assured her that she was fine, which was a relief for the Duchess, yet she mentioned that if Elodie felt unwell, she could come to her. That's when the protagonist commented about the gift Demis gave her, regretting that she had to use it all during that conflict. The Duchess confirmed that she had heard about it and said that even she couldn't have made better use of it, then asked if she would like to have some more with her. Elodie thanked her and agreed, and Demis promised that she would prepare more for her, but for now, she should rest because it was getting quite late. The Duke said she could take as much time as she needed to rest, and Elodie thanked them again, wishing them good night. When everyone left, the protagonist sighed, hardly believing that she could barely breathe with all that attention, but it seemed they had left an intruder behind. Elodie asked Karl if he wanted something because he should be brief due to her exhaustion. The last time she saw him, his injuries seemed severe, but she assumed he must have healed because there were no more scratches on her brother. Then Karl tensed up and asked why she didn't take his hand earlier. Was she that determined to die? Elodie asked if he was disappointed that she returned safely, something he denied immediately, raising his voice. Sighing, the protagonist asked him to be clearer because she didn't have the strength to argue now. He should drop the formalities. But Elodie was completely caught off guard when he rushed forward to hug her, confessing that he had been worried to death. And although she accused him of acting like a lunatic, Karl asserted that he was perfectly sane. This shocked Elodie because she never imagined seeing him cry like that, so she asked him to calm down and explain what she had done to deserve this, and if this was his way of tormenting her. Then Karl stepped back, apologizing to his sister, because he had harmed her in so many ways. All this time, he despised her, spoke to her indifferently, mocked the circumstances of her birth, and found ways to punish her at every turn. But now he had no one to blame for his actions but himself, even though he was certain that the mere sight of him must disgust her. But Elodie was too shocked to understand and asked if she had ever said something like that to him before. Karl replied that there was no need because it was clear from the way she looked and spoke to him. For some reason, it seemed like some kind of character development for him. Until Elodie commented that it was true because Karl himself said she was filthy and that he didn't want to touch her, which made him flinch and retort that he had been a cruel scoundrel to say such things. There was nothing impure about her, quite the opposite, and he hugged her again, which left her frozen in place once more, not knowing how to react. Gripping her shoulders, he promised that from now on, he would protect Elodie with his life, with Ishtar as his witness, and would become a loyal guard dog at her disposal. And the protagonist wondered if he even had any idea what he was saying, still completely shocked by his sudden change in behavior. Later, when she visited her father's office and met with Ryan, the protagonist smiled, though this didn't please the Duke, who commented on how they already seemed close to be calling each other by their first names. Elodie apologized, saying she'd have forgotten due to her great joy, but at least she wanted her father to have called her so she could receive the guest by his side. After all, she hadn't had the chance to properly thank Ryan for saving her life. Sylvester agreed, because that was the next thing on his mind. However, the protagonist knew that her father hadn't intended to call her, While she was dealing with her clingy and tearful brother Carl, Martha had burst into her room, talking about the handsome visitor of the Duke. Elodie asked if she had interrupted an important conversation, and her father replied that they were actually discussing her reward for being rescued. And Ryan agreed, saying he had the honor of coming to her aid and was telling the Duke that he would be honored if he would grant him a favor in return. In fact, he would like to become Elodie's retainer, formally introducing himself as Yam, the captain of the Sky Falcons, catching her completely off guard. She recognized that name. 2 years ago, he was famous in the war against the kingdom of Nelta and earned the Emperor's favor to the point that not even the nobles could look down on him. They called him Iron, the mercenary king. Although he was of common birth, he was also well known in high society, and Elodie had heard of his name and reputation. At that, the protagonist asked if she should understand that he wanted to offer his services to her as a hired knight, and he agreed. However, she asked the reason why, as she doubted he was in need of money and didn't understand what he stood to gain. Iron confessed that the second prince of Valentio was currently trying to bind him to his own services, and the protagonist realized that Beltran had finally made his move. It could be his way of asserting his candidacy for the throne, so it would be wise of her to accept Iron's offer and deprive the second prince of a valuable ally. And the best part of it all was that she wouldn't have to tolerate Carl as her guard dog anymore. Since Iron's very existence was an unpredictable card, it could also be beneficial to keep an eye on him. In many ways, this was an offer she could hardly pass up. Elodie quickly agreed, only to be interrupted by the Duke, who forbade it, asking if she could even trust this man she had just met. The protagonist agreed because Iron had saved her life and didn't even have any obligation to do so. But Sylvester retorted, asking how she could be sure that he had no ulterior motives, that he couldn't have been connected to the assassins from the very beginning. Elodie stated that she believed Iron's proposal was a blessing for the Perdia house. If the rest of the Empire and beyond saw the infamous Sky Falcons forging a close alliance with their house, it could strengthen the influence of the Crown Prince. After a moment of silent staring, Sylvester sighed and agreed with his daughter, judging that he could draft the contract himself. On another day, during tea in the garden, Elodie reflected on how foolish she was for not realizing that Ryan was Iron from the beginning, especially since the pseudonym wasn't very different from his real name. Anyway, it seemed he would remain by her side, which spared her from having to seek him out, but it was still unknown if he deserved her trust or not. And even as she hoped to enjoy a moment of tranquility during tea time, she noticed that her brothers had other intentions when approaching her. Elodie asked Martha for a moment alone with them, and she left while Elodie mentioned that she remembered saying she wanted to stay alone in the guest house, but they must have forgotten that. Then she asked her what pleasure she owed their company now, making the two smile as Carl commented that they hoped she could satisfy their curiosity regarding the upcoming palace banquet. They asked whom she planned to choose to go with her, but none of the options seemed good, so Elodie replied that she was going with Iron. But neither of them knew who he was, and Carl complained, asking why, while Yancy appeared slightly irritated that they were so quickly replaced by a stranger. The protagonist replied that it was obvious because the Crown Prince almost never attended these balls, and she always had to go alone. Now that Iron was her personal guard, she thought it would be a pleasant change to have him accompany her. Although Carl insisted that he was her personal guard, Yancy cut him off with a smile, asking if she had known the mercenary king before, and Elodie agreed, although it was only a brief encounter in the streets. He continued, asking to what extent she truly knew him. Meanwhile, Iron was being asked what he was thinking, getting involved with the Perdias just on a whim, and he told them to shut up because these were his decisions alone. But the knight replied that clearly it wasn't, as he couldn't help but worry about the fact that Iron seemed to have lost his senses in such a way. Iron said it was none of his business, closing his eyes as he thought of Galyal Yun. In this life, he swore that he would not allow her life to end in tragedy. Meanwhile, Elodie wondered what exactly Yancy knew about Ian that she didn't, and she asked her brother more about it. He leaned closer, saying that it would be wise for her to be wary of strange men, especially people like him. It was obvious that Yancy knew more than he let on. Yancy was the undisputed master of shady dealings for the Perdia house, so it was clear he was more informed about Ian than she was, and she didn't think he would warn her about Ian without good reason. That's why she thought it would be wise to hear what he had to say, and Elodie proceeded by asking him to explain his good reasons for his suspicions. To that, he replied that it was just because, which left the protagonist confused, but he continued, saying that if she wanted a good reason, to start with, there was no conceivable reason for a Perdia to associate with a mere mercenary. Nor could they be sure that he was honorable, but Yancy mentioned that there was no need to worry about that. Because she was too innocent to hear the rest, it made Elodie feel that, deep down, Yancy didn't have good reasons to distrust him. She had hoped that Yancy could provide some valuable information, but it was clear that Ian was still hiding something from her. The best thing she could do for now was learn while Ian served her as her new guard. Furthermore, she insisted on knowing why Yancy was holding her hand like that, and Yancy responded that Elodie's ordeal had given them a terrible scare, and he thought it was good to hold her hand to calm his nerves. That's why he wanted to keep holding it, fearing he might completely fall apart if he let go. That version of Yancy was anything but the one she knew, and Carl complained that he also needed some calming and wanted to hold her other hand. Faced with a situation where both her brothers were holding her hands, she wondered if this was some kind of nightmare. Meanwhile, at the palace, Dorothea was received by Empress Salvatrice, who praised her, saying she looked more radiant than ever, and Dorothea thanked the Empress, even though the Empress's own radiance overshadowed everyone at the banquet that day. Dorothea Angelos was the only daughter of Duke Rodrigo Angelos, the Duke's treasured girl as the only daughter in his eyes. Although the Angelos house had not yet formally declared their support, the Duke had long backed the second prince's claim to the throne, thus consolidating a special bond between his mother, Empress Salvatrice, and the Angelos family. The Empress hoped Dorothea would enjoy the party that evening. After all, she loved the attention it brought her. Dorothea was content to let people whisper about her because she would be the star of the ball again this year, until she heard voices saying they could have sworn that Dorothea would be wearing that dress, the famous one that was actually taken by the Lady of Perdia, the dress from the boutique asterisk, La Belle Chic asterisk. It wasn't often that Dorothea was outdone by a dress like that, and she thought it seemed as if Elodie was putting in a lot of effort for the royal banquet this year. But she would soon find out that not all the daughters of dukes were the same. She was the only legitimate heiress, beloved both at home and in high society, while Elodie was just a child born out of wedlock, never loved except for her appearance. Not in a million years could she be outshined by someone like that. Then, a bit later, they announced the arrival of Elodie and Captain Ian of the Sky Falcons, and everyone was shocked that the captain was at the ball by her side. Even Dorothea froze because a man who had never even appeared at a palace event and rejected all advances from other debutantes was suddenly there. She wondered why he was with that Perdia brat, picturing a mental image of how malicious Elodie must be, fuming as she questioned what tricks she had used to deceive Captain Ian. Until they also announced the arrival of Duke Sylvester, Duchess Demis, and Lords Yancy and Carl Perdia. It was outrageous to Dorothea, unable to believe that all the members of the Perdia house made an entrance together like this to steal the attention. Everyone commented equally shocked because they had never seen them all together in one place, and they certainly weren't looking particularly friendly. In the end, the star of the ball became Elodie, receiving numerous compliments because she looked stunning, behaved better than usual, and appeared like an angel. Suddenly, all of Dorothea's efforts were overshadowed by just one entrance, although the protagonist herself only wanted to go home, unaware that Dorothea intended to make her pay for all this humiliation. Meanwhile, the first prince decided to take a break from his work, remembering that it was the day of the Empress's banquet. He asked to be informed if there was any news about Elodie, as he heard that she would be attending without a partner, but the assistant reported that she had brought someone. At that, Adamir asked if it was Beltran. Unfortunately, it wasn't the case, but it seemed to be another man. This made the prince think that she wanted to annul the engagement, but he was still her fiancé by law, frustrated that she dared to take another man as her partner publicly like this. He got up, wondering if she even had the slightest notion of her position in society, deciding to leave and attend the banquet, wanting to see with his own eyes what kind of rascal she had found this time. At the ball, the protagonist received dance requests first from Yancy and Carl, which made Demis ask if they couldn't leave poor Elodie alone. She didn't want them to bother her savior Ian either. Around them, people whispered in surprise, never imagining that Elodie had such a healthy relationship with her brothers, not to mention that the Duchess addressed her with great cordiality and that the Duke of Perdia looked at her in a surprisingly affectionate manner. No one could tell what had changed within their mansion. For something like this to happen, even Elodie wanted to ask the same questions because she didn't understand the source of such a commotion. That was when Ayan asked if the ball made her uncomfortable, and she smiled, replying that there were more people than she was used to seeing. Every time her family appeared before the entire high society, the admiration they received was always the same. The Duke of Perdia, the feared lord of one of the 4 great houses, the Duchess, the continent's foremost expert in poisons, and their 2 sons, the powerful heirs of the Perdia family's blessings. Being able to establish ties with this family was a coveted blessing for everyone, a prize they sought to gain through their flattery, portraying the image of a perfect family. Meanwhile, Elodie was like a permanent blemish on that painting, an unpleasant presence, a flaw, a disgrace, the ugly duckling. These labels were partly due to her own conduct, and she no longer felt the pain of these remarks as she once did. Yet, under the grand chandelier of the ballroom, she could still feel the watchful eyes surrounding her more intensely than usual. This was something Elodie should have expected from the beginning, and Ayan could see that something was bothering her. After stammering for a moment, Elodie said she thought he must know all about causing trouble, especially among impressionable debutantes. This caught him off guard, but the protagonist asked him to take it as a compliment, though Ayan wasn't entirely convinced it was just a joke. Then she suggested that he look around, proposing that they find a place to escape the gaze of the girls who were staring at Ayan so intensely. He asked if it wasn't expected that they should greet friends and acquaintances before that. While they were talking, the first prince observed the man Elodie had brought to the ball, thinking that they truly made an unlikely pair, and the 2 conversed with Elodie wanting to leave because she wasn't there to make friends. They stepped outside for some fresh air, and Elodie commented that he should have seen the look on the second Prince Beltran's face, to which Ayan replied that he did, as their eyes met in the ballroom for a moment, quickly realizing that it had been her intention to draw attention from the start. Thus, the operation to make Beltran jealous had been a great success. Somehow, Elodie realized that the mercenary king was older than he appeared. That was when Dorothea also stepped outside to talk with her, commenting that she was surprised to imagine Elodie was hiding there. Elodie was taken aback because Dorothea was the final villainess of the original novel, replying that she had nothing to hide from her. Feigning innocence, Dorothea said that hurt her because she thought they could call each other by their first names, making Elodie realize that she had followed them there just to provoke a fight. The protagonist laughed nervously, agreeing that it was nice to see her regardless, and then Dorothea asked for the identity of the impressive gentleman by her side, as she didn't believe they had been introduced. Elodie noticed that, in truth, Dorothea was keeping her eyes on Yan, so she explained that he was a business mercenary and her partner at the ball, making Dorothea feign surprise again, which made the protagonist feel she could have been an actress. Dorothea said that he truly was as they described, a man of few words. Perhaps a change of company could bring out his more sociable side, and she invited him to join her, certain they would have much more entertaining topics to discuss. But Ayan quickly replied that he was quite content where he was, which did not please Dorothea much, and Elodie simply watched the conversation between the incorrigible flirt and the steadfast, unyielding knight, debating whether her company was good enough or not. Unlike a secondary antagonist like Elodie, Dorothea was a sort of arch-villainess who tormented Estelle until the end. The fact that she suddenly took an interest in Yan, who didn't even have a role in the story, could only be a bad omen. Dorothea was visibly irritated at being rejected time and again until she decided to start pretending to faint in front of all of them, practically throwing herself into Yan's arms, beginning her seduction tactics right before their eyes. She thanked Yan for being there and said she would have suffered a terrible fall if she hadn't been caught in time, adding that she wished she could repay him in some appropriate way. But Ayan quickly refused and pulled his hand away, having no reaction to her seduction at all, which shocked Dorothea again. Not only that, but he took out a handkerchief to wipe the hand he had used to touch Dorothea, making her call him a barbarian, cursing him and shocking even Elodie herself. So, Dorothea left in anger, and Elodie asked if Ayan even realized what he had just done. He replied that it was Elodie herself who said it meant one less person to make friends with. After all, it seemed he was truly just a common mercenary who had just insulted a member of the Angelos family without hesitation. Ayan could have earned the favor of the emperor himself if he wanted, but given his tendency for unscrupulous tactics, it was clear that Dorothea would try to take revenge on the Sky Falcons in some way. So Elodie asked him to have faith because everything would be fine, she would protect them. It might be an open secret that she was an illegitimate child, but even so, she was still the only daughter of Duke Perdia for now. With her family's name at stake, not even Dorothea could attack her without considering the consequences. In other words, she had the power to protect Ian, and Ian thanked her, feeling deeply honored to accept her offer. Elodie then said that it was probably time for them to leave now. They shouldn't want to attract even more attention. She began to say she would go out to prepare the carriage until she was interrupted by Adamir, who approached, saying that the night's festivities were far from over and that he didn't believe she would leave without at least saying a word to her fiancé. A bit nervous, Elodie greeted the prince, who said he was intrigued to see her in such a hurry to leave, especially with the ball still in full swing. Elodie let out a small laugh, saying she wasn't used to staying out late at these events, thinking that it wasn't as if he could have known, since he never gave a second glance to any ball before. In fact, Adamir was hardly ever seen at any ball organized by the Empress, and she wondered why he chose to attend this one. Adamir asked who exactly her companion was, as he didn't seem familiar. The protagonist introduced him as her personal guard, appointed by her father, and then introduced the Crown Prince, to whom Ian made a formal bow. Adamir recognized him as the famous mercenary king of the Sky Falcons, mentioning that he had heard his brother was quite interested in him, though Ian feared he didn't wish to be won over by anyone. The prince agreed and hoped it would remain that way for a long time, considering that although he had received word that the Duke of Perdia had recently contacted the Sky Falcons, it hadn't occurred to him that it was to protect his daughter. Regardless of whether the idea had been his or not, it was an excellent decision on the Duke's part. Even if it would inevitably become the talk of high society for a while, that she had abandoned her fiancé for another man, it was still an event that could serve him quite well. Elodie asked to be excused because they were heading back to her carriage now. But even then, Adamir interrupted her again, recalling when the protagonist mentioned that she'd have fallen in love, asking if it was Ian she had been referring to. Elodie asked if it would change anything if she agreed, and he sighed, responding that it wouldn't change anything. He wished her only good luck. All he had ever wanted from the Duke's daughter was the Perdia name. It meant very little to him to know who the person in her heart was. That should have been everything, but he couldn't allow the protagonist to break off the engagement, no matter the cost, and he would forbid the idea at any price. Meanwhile, Dorothea walked furiously after everyone was only talking about Elodie everywhere she went, as if her foul mood and heinous behavior weren't enough. She was the product of a scandal and equally despised at home, but still Ian dared to make a spectacle of her, when it should have been Dorothea shining as the star of high society, the best young lady she could ever become. She thought that Elodie was far too bold to act that way toward her and would make her pay dearly for such humiliation. Suddenly, Dulcina Angelos, Dorothea's mother, appeared, asking what had happened at the ball. The daughter rushed into her arms as Dulcina said she had heard everything from the head butler. He said she had been in a foul mood since she returned. Dorothea told her that Elodie's personal guard had the audacity to insult her, enraging Dulcina upon hearing the mere guard had shown such impertinence. But it wasn't just any guard, it was Ian, the mercenary king. Dulcina was shocked, realizing they were talking about the captain of the Sky Falcons. Dorothea agreed that it was him, looking at her as if she were covered in filth. She could barely breathe from the complete degradation she had been subjected to. It was utterly humiliating. In response, Dulcina declared that he was a brute and a mercenary, and Dorothea should cheer up because they would ensure that he was properly punished. After all, a guard dog that bites an innocent person is a crime of both the dog and its owner. And Dorothea felt happy because her mother was so wise, confident that Elodie wouldn't be able to say anything in her own defense. After what was going to happen to her, Elodie wouldn't be able to defend herself. And so, a few days passed when the two went to visit Demis, who remarked that it was an unexpected sight. She was curious to know what exactly brought them there for tea, and Dulcina replied that she had written beforehand, but it seemed that the message must have been lost along the way. She mentioned having sent several messages, but never received any letter in return, and asked if the Duchess had been busy lately, which was unfortunate for Demis, because she worried that her butler might have been delivering the correspondence according to the order of urgency. Other than that, she was actually a woman with plenty of free time, which was essentially a subtle way of saying that Dulcinea's messages were not important. Dulcinea commented that the years hadn't changed her at all, although Demis remarked that she couldn't say the same about her. Dorothea thought to herself that people often said the Duke hardly seemed to age, thanks to the strict training regimen he maintained, not to mention the restorative properties of possessing a blessing. But it was nearly impossible to explain the seemingly eternal youth of his wife, Demis, who said that although they might be married women, they should always practice self-care. Realizing it was time to change the subject, Dorothy stammered that they had come to visit because she feared they needed to demand an apology from Elodie. They believed it should be a conversation held face-to-face, and Dulcinea said Demis shouldn't allow Elodie to keep her guests waiting. That's when the protagonist appeared, apologizing, saying that it was her fault and not her mother's, politely greeting them as she approached, worried that they were caught off guard by their unexpected visit. If she had known they were coming, she would have received them as soon as they arrived, thinking it was petty of them to visit only because of a superficial comment from Anne. Not that their visit was entirely a surprise, but she hadn't intended to waste Demis's time on such nonsense. Elodie had always been taught to address Demis as her mother in the company of others, but it had been so rare that it barely rolled off her tongue naturally. This made her wonder if the Duchess found it unpleasant, but she had to understand that Elodie was just doing as she was taught. Elodie then said that she had heard the visit was because they had something to say to her, to which Dorothea agreed, mentioning the recent royal ball where her guard had caused a great offense. Elodie recalled Dorothea approaching Iron, then complaining of nausea and leaning against him. Perhaps that was the offense being mentioned. Dorothea added that she forgot to mention that he wiped his hands with a handkerchief as if she were dirty and even threw the handkerchief on the floor right in front of her eyes. The protagonist acknowledged this as Dorothea insisted that she recognize it. Her low-born, arrogant guard insulted her on purpose. Even so, Elodie knew who had shown interest first, despite calling him arrogant, and responded that she believed Ian was simply wiping some dirt off his hands, but admitted that he acted in a way that could have offended her. Dorothea raised her voice, agreeing, because she wanted an apology, and the protagonist acknowledged it, apologizing as Ian's employer and saying she was sorry for the misunderstanding. This shocked the two guests because the unruly brat, Elodie Perdia, had just apologized to their faces. The protagonist asked if that satisfied them, and Dorothea stammered a yes. With that, Demis stood up, believing that the conversation was concluded for the day, suggesting that the girls make peace by having some tea together. Surprised, Dulcinea replied that she wasn't very thirsty, and Demis teased that she might be afraid the tea would be poisoned. Smiling, Elodie said that her mother made a beautiful cup of tea with the best taste and fragrance, and hoped that the two of them could experience it, leaving both women tense and trembling. They decided to drink, even sweating as Elodie remarked that it was indeed delicious, which was a relief since she would have been horrified if they thought she was poisoning them. Only fools would be brazen enough to serve poisoned tea in their own homes, no matter how unwelcome the guests might be. Dulcinea commented that Elodie was indeed as shrewd as her mother. One could almost suppose they were blood relatives. This made the protagonist remember that she suspected Dulcinea always knew Elodie was illegitimate and wanted to mock Demis for accepting another woman's daughter as her own, simply to make the Duchess feel uncomfortable. However, the Duchess stated that Elodie was her daughter, ignoring the guests' cheap provocation. It didn't take long before they left quickly. For Elodie, it was a wise move to fear the greatest poison expert in Valentia, and she apologized to Demis for taking up so much of her time with her indiscretion. Before, she feared that Demis would make her beg on her knees, calling her insolent, but it was strange to hear her telling Dulcinea that Elodie was her daughter. She hadn't expected Demis to defend her. Demis said it had been a good distraction from her boredom and handed Elodie a vial to drink, saying she would hate for her daughter to fall victim to a little prank. Surprised, the protagonist realized that the Duchess had indeed poisoned the tea, but Demis assured her she didn't need to be shocked because it wasn't anything lethal. The Angelus girls just wouldn't want to leave the mansion for a while. Elodie stammered that she understood. No wonder Demis was the master of poisons. She practically ran out of the greenhouse. This made the Duchess sigh because she had been looking forward to spending some time with Elodie, but she still found her adorable, always thinking she lived in fear of her, the stepmother who was a poison expert, shivering like a newborn kitten every time she extended her hand. Demis had even learned to keep her distance and give Elodie space to adapt and feel comfortable. Then one day, Elodie changed her mind and came to her willingly, first suddenly offering her a vile antidote and now learning to smile. For Demis, it was a pity because she had started enjoying hearing her call her Elodie instead of Duchess during that time. Meanwhile, Dorothea complained to her mother about what had happened, as her skin was breaking out in hives from some horrible pollen. Even with her mother consoling her, she kept complaining, saying that she saw how that witch Elodie provoked her right in her face, and they insulted her as a bastard child, while she, on the other hand, was a direct descendant of the Angelos house with an extra blessing. There was no comparison. But it didn't make sense because when Elodie arrived at the greenhouse, she and Demis greeted each other like loving mother and daughter. Theorizing that Elodie must have done something to stay in her father's favor, just the thought of her being forced to play house for the child born out of wedlock made Dulcina think Demis had degraded as a woman. Still, she reassured her daughter that everything would be resolved soon. At home, she asked a staff member where Rodrigo was, and he responded that he was currently receiving a guest, something she had completely forgotten. All her husband had said was that it was a very important guest, but she had no idea what he would want for the mage. When she entered, Rodrigo greeted her, shocked because there was something different about her face, and she felt pleased that her husband had noticed and must have found it attractive. But he commented that she should buy a mirror, until Dorothea came running in, screaming that her skin was ruined with so many blemishes, making both women scream in shock when they realized what had happened. And so the news spread about how Dorothea withdrew from high society, making Elodie smile because it was a misfortune entirely caused by themselves. It was remarkable that no poison had been detected in their bodies. She supposed Demis was indeed a master at hiding her tracks. Suddenly, she noticed small pebbles being thrown at the window where she was, only to be caught off guard when she realized it was Karl who wanted to talk to her. When realizing that he had only come up there to see her, Elodie reminds him that she told him to come because he might end up getting hurt in the trees. Although Karl replies that it wouldn't be a bother and that he could stay right there, Elodie thinks it would indeed be a problem and stares at him when she hears his stomach growling, murmuring. So, as not to worry about him because he had been out all day and didn't have the chance to eat yet, drawing a sigh from the protagonist when she agreed that he could stay until he finished his meal, making him quite excited as he entered her room to eat beside her, asking if she would like to join him. But Elodie responds that she is fine and that he can eat as much as he wants. Then after a moment, he mentions that he had been wondering about something for some time, which was the reason why the guest house seemed always so empty. Elodie replies that there was a reason for that. To begin with, she doubted anyone would be too eager to spend time with an ill-tempered, illegitimate child. Still, it wasn't like the house was entirely devoid of staff. They simply did an impressive job staying out of her sight. She supposed Martha was the only exception, who wandered around the house a bit too freely sometimes, which made Karl shrink back, apologizing because it was obvious that he didn't know that. And he quickly changes the subject, mentioning that he had news about the culprits behind their ambush. He had been investigating the incident under his father's order together with Yancy. When they examined their bodies, they detected symptoms of mana poisoning. Generally, mages were naturally connected to mana, the source of magical energy. But if a layperson without magical aptitude was exposed to mana for too long, it was possible to suffer the harmful effects of mana poisoning. These characteristic symptoms could only point to one thing: the involvement of a mage's tower. Not only were they ambushed at the entrance leading to the southern mage's tower, but the attackers were somehow involved with the mages. Could it be a mere coincidence? Elodie thinks that their target should be herself, but not Karl, and she wonders if someone could benefit from her death. Her first and main priority should consist of discovering her enemy's identity now. However, the problem was the 4 mage towers. Located in the north, south, east, and west, each was an independent institution with its own goals and agendas, although the 4 mage towers were often mentioned collectively as if they were united as one. That could not be further from the truth. For now, she decides that she should start by asking questions to the Western Tower itself, because she already had business there, so she left by carriage with Iron after instructing the coachman to take them to the location in question. Sitting in front of her was the man who saved her life, the war hero they called the Mercenary King. Not to mention, he was the only one who knew her true secret. She supposed she should be quite anxious about the fact that her secret had been revealed. But in fact, for the protagonist, it was a relief. In this cold-hearted world where she was nothing more than a side character, the simple fact that someone knew her for who she was, deep down, was already enough of a consolation, and Elodie smiles as she asks Zayn if the Sky Falcons accept contracts to track down someone's whereabouts, and he agrees depending on who it was. So she comments about a person called Estelle, but he asked for her to be more specific than that, which makes Elodie think that unless Ian is pretending ignorance, perhaps he is not a soul from another world who migrated into this novel as she had theorized. After all, no one who knew the story would say they did not recognize the name Estelle, so she explains that her request was for him to make an effort to find this woman named Estelle. She had light brown hair and blue eyes, and was a year or two older than Elodie. Ian asks if she only had these details about her, and the protagonist laughs nervously because she feared that was all she had to share, although she thought Estelle was raised in an orphanage. The novel never described her origins in detail. It would be much easier if she could at least know her hometown. That's when Ian mentioned that they were close to the Mage's Tower. For now, Elodie would leave the search to the Sky Falcons and handle her own business, and then she enters the tower, asking to know about her investment. The attendant asks if she would like to know more about their latest products, but Elodie clarifies that she only wanted to add the entire sum to her investments. Most recent, shocking the attendant because it was a large sum of money. So he creates another document asking her to add the recipient and her name, and soon he finds the paper that the protagonist had signed earlier, with the first name being Lily Arcel, and Elodie confirms that it was indeed her, despite the attendant's shock as he rushes off, ignoring his pleas to wait, bringing a smile to Elodie's face because she knew this was one of the perks of living in a magical world. Whenever there was paperwork, everything was done in a magical manner, without even needing to wave a wand. Now that her business was done, she could do some sightseeing until she noticed that Ian was talking to another hooded person, and when the protagonist approached, she asked if it was an acquaintance when the hooded figure quickly left, and Ian responded that it was not the case, but rather just a stranger. They were also looking for someone, apparently, and it was a person called Lily Arcel, which shocked her because it was her pseudonym. Suddenly someone shouted while pointing at Elodie, and Ian grabbed her shoulder, asking what her orders would be now. Faced with this, the protagonist had no choice but to acknowledge that they couldn't run in this situation, which made Ian request permission to draw his sword and force their way through, immediately making her worried because there were certainly better ways to handle this, and one of the hooded figures stammered, apologizing because they thought they had scared them due to their haste, explaining that they only intended to escort Lily back as their esteemed guest, as the master of the tower was requesting her presence. This caught her off guard, wondering what exactly he wanted with her, without understanding why these men were looking at her with such presumptuous expressions. Maybe they expected Elodie to faint from the sheer honor of an audience with a tower master, and she imagines that perhaps they believed she was a little girl easily impressed, without even knowing that she belonged to House Perdia, with the relentless Duke, the poisoner mother, and her competent yet somewhat unstable brothers. It was a pity that she could not reveal her true identity yet, but she didn't know how else she could teach those nobles a lesson, and one of them promptly asked Elodie to follow them because their master was a busy man and didn't like to wait, but she demanded an apology, questioning if she even looked like an idle lady to be dragged around at their master's disposal, and if it was customary for the Western Tower and its master to address clients with such disrespect. They nervously stammered that it was not their intention, becoming even more tense under Ian's intimidating gaze, which quickly made them apologize for it. That said, Elodie accepts the apology and asks them to show the way, deciding to see what their master had to say to her. Thus, they go up to the top floor of the Western Mage Tower, and the man who guided them asks them to wait a little because the master would soon join them. They sit while being told to make themselves at home, although Elodie could not do so in the office of the man who might have hired her supposed assassins. Without Ian accompanying her, she would never have agreed to come up. She supposed that she should investigate the ambush, which was part of the reason she went to the tower that day, but she never thought that she would do so face to face with the tower master himself, until she began trying to grab one of the sweets, but Ian interrupts her, suggesting that she not touch the drinks. They couldn't dismiss the possibility of it being poisoned, and Elodie realizes that he shouldn't know anything about her blessing, eating despite his warning, and assures him that there was no poison there, she could say for certain, even offering some to Ian, who preferred not to eat anything if it was no problem. It could risk seeming impertinent, but they couldn't afford to act carelessly, so he wanted to insist that she exercise caution to fulfill his duty properly. It was practically a situation for begging, and the protagonist could see this, even if Ian made her seem like a troublemaker. While she ate, suddenly a door opens and a boy with light hair and blue eyes enters, and Elodie smiles, asking if he was lost, shocking the boy when he complained by shouting because she was addressing him as if he were a child. She should have known that he was Archmage Ithis, the master of the Western Mage Tower. Laughing when Elodie acknowledged him, it seemed it didn't take much for her to recall proper social customs, although the protagonist thought she could never have imagined that this boy was the Tower Master. Then, she exaggerated a bit when asking the great mage Ithis, the revered master of the Western Mage Tower, to explain the reason for the invitation. He replies that she flatters him with her silver tongue, cheeky, but still pleasing to hear. Getting straight to the point, he heard that Elodie had been funding the mage Elvie and summoned her because he wanted her to answer some questions about this particular member of his tower. She was, after all, the first to invest in Elvie's work, and he wanted to know what she saw in him that he couldn't see in that mage. The protagonist replies that she simply has faith in the success of Elvie's inventions with all her heart. She had heard that his next creation would be a crystal with the power to control temperature, an ingenious invention that could certainly be a huge success. That was when the protagonist was caught by surprise when Ithis begins to share that he had long been pressured to abandon his pointless research and dedicate himself solely to the tower, but he finally found someone with the same opinion who appreciates his work. It was clear that talent recognized talent, and it was obvious that Elodie was a woman of extraordinary vision. The protagonist wonders if Elvie was actually a pseudonym of the Archmage of the Western Tower himself, and if he was just curious to meet the first person who invested in his magical devices. It might be too early to say, but he certainly didn't seem to be the type involved with assassinations, ambushes, or anything of the sort. So Elodie asks if there was any reason for him to be hiding his true name, and Ithis agrees since any item with his own name would sell like hotcakes, but his real aspiration was to create magitech that would be of practical benefit to everyone, a magitech that could be admired for its own merit. Elodie smiles because he really did seem like a child speaking in that manner. The original novel only mentioned that each of Elvie's magitech creations would be a great success in the future, but it was never even suggested that Elvie was the master of the Western Tower. But since they've reached this point, it wouldn't hurt to give a little push in the right direction, so she would like to suggest that he try to include a mattress that could keep the bed warm at night in his latest creation. On the other hand, it could make things cold and keep it inside a sealed box so that food could stay fresh even in the summer sun, maybe with an ice compartment, which shocked Ithis because she was indeed a genius. He could even think of some military applications that could be quite profitable, which impressed Ithis enough to decide to make her his apprentice. It wasn't often that they saw such a high intellect walking through their doors, especially someone who saw genuine value in his work. But Elodie quickly declines to the boy's surprise, while explaining that she feared it would be a great inconvenience for her, though Ithis can't understand because there would be no one else under his tutelage, and Elodie sighs, responding that she simply aspired to be a lazy, idle person and nothing more. Faced with that, Ithis agrees that she could do as she pleases. But the least she could do was lend him her insight from time to time, practically begging the protagonist, who responds that she would consider it. Despite saying that, she mentally knew that it would only be to her great advantage to accept the proposal. She would be a fool to refuse a golden opportunity to gain early access to market information, which brought a smile to her face that made Ian stare at her, while Ithis got excited and said that to celebrate this situation, he would show her something that could pique her interest, presenting for her to admire his latest invention, a bright pink item that makes Elodie ask what exactly it was for. Proudly, he responds that there was only one purpose for the crystal she was seeing, to bring the complete and utter ruin of Duke Sylvester Perdia, and the protagonist takes a moment to understand what he was saying before staring at Ithis in shock, and he seemed satisfied because he left her speechless as he explained that he was referring to the tyrant who leads. The unbearable House Perdia, commenting with a laugh about how she stayed silent, probably because his invention left her at a loss for words. With a nervous laugh, the protagonist agrees and then asks in what way it would serve to attack a formidable enemy like Duke Perdia, because she honestly had no idea that the master of the Western Tower saw the Duke as an enemy, and Ithis says that just not having to suffer the repulsive sight of him anymore would already be worth it. Besides, there was something that he coveted for himself, which piqued Elodie's curiosity once again, because the novel never mentioned any of this before, and Ithis asks if she always. I needed to stare at him as if every word were impressive, and the protagonist apologizes with a smile because he was nothing like she had imagined before, and he confirmed that just as she should have guessed, this was not his true form. His childish appearance was only intended to keep his vast mana reserve under control. By the way, there was another reason he sought Elodie, and the protagonist wonders if there was something beyond curiosity as the first investor. At that moment, Ithis says that her name was quite similar to someone he knew, a woman named Arcelia, and Elodie's eyes widen when he asks if she knew this name, to which the protagonist inquires what exactly he knew about her mother, shocking Ithis this time, who never imagined the two were related. Then, Elodie reveals that Lily Arcel was a pseudonym. Although she still hesitates to reveal it, her real name was Elodie Perdia. She then removes her hood, asking what his relationship was with her real mother, Arcelia, and Ithis begins to explain, briefly, that he had a debt to her that he could never repay because she was the reason for his existence in the present. That's why he had been looking for her ever since. Despite all the memories of his last life, Elodie did not remember her mother, not only because she had died a long time ago when she recovered her memories from her previous life. Even with all the knowledge of Ga Yol Yun, there were few things he could extract from the novel about the biological mother of Elodie Perdia. Perhaps this was not without good reason, as she was a villain in the story, to be defeated by the virtuous Estelle, an unfortunate antagonist, and on top of that, a secondary character, so no reader would care about the story and the past involving Elodie, including the mother of the villain, to which it seemed Ithis had genuine gratitude for her. Once, in her childhood, Elodie made the mistake of asking about her mother, and the mansion staff made sure to make it clear that she would have no naive illusion, saying that she had been heartlessly abandoned by her mother, and that she had used her to extort money from the Perdia house and soon after disappeared. Knowing what she knew now, she wondered why Arcelia chose to leave her at the mercy of the Perdia house instead of taking her to the safety of the service house to which her father belonged. This intrigued the protagonist until now, but one thing she knew was that she did not seem to be the type to provide selfless help, and she wondered how the Arcelia she knew differed from the one she had heard about. Ithis says that Elodie had more than just a slight resemblance to her, to which the protagonist agrees that she would have to believe him. This surprised the wizard, because she spoke as if she had never met her, thus he could go back there when he sent a message. It would not be of any use to them now without the necessary preparations. But there was a gadget that restored her memories, and with it he could give her a glimpse of Arcelia's face. Until they left the tower, the master continued calling Elodie Lily Arcel. It was clear that he had no love for the name Perdia. This made her wonder what kind of reason had generated the discord between him and her father, and Ian asked if the protagonist was okay because something must have been bothering her. Turning her face away, she replied that it was just a small moment of sadness, thinking that before she thought her past might no longer hurt her, but whether it was the persistent resentment of having been abandoned or a childhood memory, she could not shake off. The mere mention of her mother made her want to cry in a strange way. In any case, as Ithis promised to show her with his memory restoration device, soon things could be clarified. Suddenly, Yancy appeared calling her Lily to take her home in the corridors of the tower, and Elodie froze in shock, wondering what he was doing there. Throughout all those years she had known him, she discovered that the wider Yancy's smile was, the more irritating his behavior became, and she wondered what could have irritated him this time. He said she would be going with him, thanking and dismissing Ian from his duties. To Elodie, it was clear that the Duke would find out that she had been summoned by the Master of the Western Tower. She hoped to leave that matter aside, but ended up being naive to think it would be that easy, so she sighed because she would need to hear another scolding in her father's office. When Elodie approached her brother, Ian even tried to extend his hand, but she turned to say goodbye to him, and he just accepted and bid her farewell as well. At the mansion, Sylvester demanded to know the meaning of the scene she caused in the Western Tower, wanting to understand if she had met with the master of the tower and what they talked about. Elodie stammers that it was nothing important, already imagining this would have happened from the beginning, but the Duke demands that she be direct and honest, promising he wouldn't bite her or anything like that if that's what she feared. But Elodie didn't even know where to start, because there certainly wasn't anything positive to say about many things besides her mother and her investment, recalling how Ithis hated Sylvester with all of his heart, practically shouting that he was a disgrace to his marital vows. He harassed every woman he met as if they were toys, and Elodie only says he was a manipulator, which certainly irritated the Duke because they were talking about him in his absence. Elodie feels cold, trying to explain that those were Ithis's words, not hers, mentally lamenting placing all the blame on the master. She hoped the tower's walls would keep him safe. Sylvester asks what other things that coward said, and the protagonist stammers that he was inventing a magitech device that would cause his destruction, and it seemed he had something the wizard coveted. The Duke agrees that there was indeed something that was of interest to Ithis. The protagonist asks if she could know what it was, but he replies he could only say it was a sacred treasure of the Perdia house, and Elodie gets excited because it was a family treasure. It should be some ancient inheritance from the roots of the Perdia house as one of the 7 great houses. Sylvester goes on to say she didn't need to worry and asks her what she thought about moving from the guest house to the main house, to which she questions if everything was okay. Sylvester says it was time for her to return, so he would prepare her room in the main house because it had been empty for too long, not knowing when she would be ready to come back. Time had passed quickly in the meantime, and he was sure she would agree. Elodie wonders if this was the Duke's way of rewarding her because he had improved his behavior lately. It was quite a change on his part, but she also considered that he might expect something in return for this. For a long time, she had wanted nothing more than to set foot in the main house again, but since the maids always talked about how she was a miserable girl wandering through the main house, calling her a pathetic little thing because she must have been desperate to be called back, it was ridiculous for a bastard born out of wedlock to be in the main house. They said she should thank the goddess for the fact that they at least let her stay in the guest house. She had to learn her place. They felt pity for the Duchess because of one night of indiscretion, and then a treacherous woman gave birth to a child and ran off with a millionaire's son. It was a scandal, and they claimed that Arcelia fled the country with the money. Although Elodie's relationship with the inhabitants of the Perdia mansion had also improved with her attitude, it didn't make it any easier to reciprocate their smiles. In their eyes, she would always be a stranger, so the protagonist thanks her father for the proposal, but states she was fine where she was now, thinking that besides that, the moment he knew she wasn't even of the Perdia lineage, he would expel her anyway. This was not her home, and they were not her real family. Back in her room, it wasn't long before Elodie was called by Carl, getting annoyed because she had told him several times to show up at the guest house without warning. But he smiles, asking if she was leaving home again, and she responds rudely that he wouldn't need to ask if he paid attention. She then inquires what he wanted by visiting her, to which he says he would like to show her something because he heard it was fashionable among debutantes at the moment, showing accessories to Elodie. She wonders if he found a friend, complimenting the accessories for being pretty, and he gets excited, saying they were for her. But the protagonist didn't understand what she did to receive such luxurious gifts. Carl asks if it was so strange for a loving brother to give gifts to his older sister. Although Elodie agrees it seems strange and that she couldn't accept, he already left them behind, which was quite bold of him. She sighs in relief that at least she was in the guest house. It would be even worse if they were all living together. Ian asks if that was why Elodie had been going out frequently in the past few days. The two had gone out to enter the carriage, and he apologizes for overhearing, but it seemed like something or someone in the mansion was bothering her. Elodie replies that it was a stray cat that came to meow when she preferred to be alone, and he asks if she didn't like felines, to which she denies because she actually liked them, except for that other particular cat. It didn't take long for the two to reach their destination, and Elodie asks Celian if she wasn't clear in saying she wanted a discreet place to be alone. Despite his agreement, she still thought he exaggerated a bit by literally building a castle just for that. He explains that this was the base of the Skyhawks, where he could find several empty rooms for her to use, shocking Elodie because he brought her to the mercenaries' den. Not that she minded, but she really wouldn't allow any interruptions and wanted Lion to ensure that. He agrees, since there wouldn't be a soul there who wouldn't obey his orders, and Elodie smiles in response. Ian feared that her quarters might be a bit messy, not fully prepared for use yet, and Elodie replies that there was no problem at all. She intended to just take a quick look around for now. Her knight responds that he could let her know if she needed anything and would do his best to accommodate her. Suddenly, the captain's assistant appears, surprised because he didn't expect to see him arrive so early, even though he should be at the Perdia estate. Not understanding why he offered himself for such a mission, even having heard that he was supposed to protect a little tyrant, Elodie wonders if he was even seeing the so-called tyrant right in front of him. He continues talking about how she was known for pulling out clumps of hair from anyone who displeased her at high society balls, laughing because they called her a wild dog. Then, Ian glares at him and threatens Mark not to say anything else, and Mark even thought it was noble of him, because usually he just told him to shut up. Until he notices Elodie behind him, asking who the beautiful lady was behind him, and if she happened to be the first of the Hawks, and the protagonist smiles at him, saying he could refer to her as the wild dog of the Perdia house, being delighted to meet him, making Mark break into a cold sweat, while Elodie confirmed that she indeed loved pulling out clumps of hair from those who displeased her, and thus Ian orders him to do 20 push-ups, continuing until he tells him to stop as a penalty for his words. As they walk through the corridors, the captain apologizes to Elodie for his subordinate, although he punished him as he deemed appropriate. If she wished, he could give him another punishment. This elicits a laugh from the protagonist, thinking that this must have been on Ian's mind the whole time, and replying that it was nothing. She was used to hearing malicious whispers behind her back, so there was no need to give it importance. Still, Ian stopped and turned to Elodie, saying he would give due attention to it, because she deserved that and much more. He wouldn't allow careless lips to utter a single sigh to offend her honor. Continuing to walk, Ian explains that that part of the castle didn't receive many visitors, but he would make sure it was strictly forbidden to access it while she was there, so she could freely explore the place at her leisure and let him know if she found anything she desired. Then he leaves the protagonist alone to rest. When she closed the door, Elodie lay down on the bed, sighing. It was indeed a modest room, but perfect for recovering after ingesting poison. Still, she wondered if she could continue depending on Ian's favors for so long. Since they met, he hadn't shown anything that came close to a bad intention. He had been dedicated in his efforts to save her from danger and had willingly offered to protect her and stay by her side, a priceless kindness that made her wonder what she did to deserve this. Could it be that the vision of her past life was enough to influence his heart? But she thought this was something she should eventually discover for herself. She needed to know what Ian might be hiding behind his kindness, and what the price would be that he would charge her after all this. A few days later, in Yancey's office, which he was working in, for some reason, Carl decided to do 100 push-ups on the floor, explaining that he was exercising to ward off boredom. Even so, Yancey asks if he needed to use his office as a training ground, suggesting he go to the fighting arena with the knights. Then, getting up, Carl asks if he noticed that Elodie had barely been at the mansion lately, and he replies that now that she wasn't grounded anymore, he saw no reason for her not to wander freely. Although for Carl it wasn't an insignificant matter, especially since a knight was nothing without someone to protect. But jokes aside, their sister seemed to be unwell lately. Yancey mentally agrees with his brother. According to the guard who recently asked to keep an eye on Elodie, it seems she went out early that morning for a brief walk through the boutiques on Toinette Avenue and then headed to the Skyhawk's fortress, just like he did every day without fail. So when he returned the other night, the staff informed him that Elodie was paler than usual. That was why he wondered what Elodie was doing. She seemed to be involved in certain dealings with her mother, although perhaps this could be related in some way. Her mother was not very tolerant of an inconvenient child, which made him hesitate to snoop. He preferred not to be poisoned by his own mother. Frustrated, Carl slammed his hands on the table to wake him from his thoughts, and Yancey said he was intrigued by how agitated he was in this way, before he could barely stand to look at Elodie. Suddenly, he was so consumed by guilt for having failed in his guard duty with her before. In this, Carl replied that he didn't know if it mattered, but he should call it a late awakening of consciousness because he realized he had been a terrible brother to her in childhood. That was why he worried that it might be too late to make amends now. Meanwhile, Adamir was being guided by the guards to meet the emperor for an audience, and he was received in the room to meet the emperor, who was in bed, coughing after confirming that the doctor had already attended to him. Adamir thought about how just 5 years earlier he had been as strong and healthy as any other man, and asked if he wouldn't find it less suffocating if they opened the windows to let in some fresh air. He replied that he didn't like the noise of the wind, and that now there was something he needed to say with all urgency, which made the prince sit up, promising his full attention to his father. The emperor explained that it was about Elodie and that he should break off his engagement with her, causing Adamir to freeze, not understanding what he was referring to. Since the passing of his mother, the late empress, the queen consort and the second prince had gained significant support among the nobles. Now, more than ever, he needed the strength of the alliance with the Perdias. The emperor agreed that it was indeed a strong alliance. It was more like a tiger's paw that tears apart the one who holds it. Despite this, Adamir responded that his wise concerns were more than understood, but despite trying to retort, his father continued saying that if he needed to ally with a beast with fangs, he suggested he choose the serpent of Angelos. This made the first prince question the suggestion because Duke Rodrigo was already in control of his brother. Still, the emperor asserted that by enchanting a serpent with a promise of gold, one could bend its will to pleasure. Faced with his father's firmness, the prince felt tense, but agreed with his words until a maid opened the door to report that the queen consort was there for an audience. Soon, Salvatris entered, smiling for not expecting to find Adamir, mentioning that it was time for the father's medicine, and Adamir stood up because he had taken up too much of his time to cover for his long absence. This drew a laugh from the queen, who responded that she wouldn't dream of interrupting a sincere conversation between father and son, asking him to smile in front of the emperor. She walked past the prince to bring the emperor's medicine, handing it to him and saying to be careful to take every last drop, staring at him intensely. Meanwhile, Mark asked what Iron's relationship with Elodie was, calling her Lily in a way that made the captain glare at him intensely. Mark explained himself, saying that she had given him permission to call her Lily, stammering and sweating when the captain began to use his power, until a bespectacled young man opened the door to deliver urgent news, causing Mark to fall to the ground, stammering because he hadn't even heard what kind of relationship the two had. But Iron ignored him, ordering the other young man to give the report. In this, he reported that large groups of 4th and 5th tier monsters had begun to appear in the Leven Forest. It was a small forest where only first-class monsters would appear, but it was suspicious that these 4th and 5th tier monsters were showing up in groups, and the captain agreed they needed to investigate, knowing they were already moving. Inside her room, the protagonist wondered what was happening outside because several people were gathered, making her feel bad for causing extra trouble even when Iron was visibly busy with his own matters. This was because a few days earlier, Elodie had asked them to find a stele for her, perhaps because she was the protagonist. She had a vague hope that it could be enough to locate her. However, nothing had happened so far, and Elodie wondered if she was even using the name Estelle, because it shouldn't be that difficult to find her. But the main route of the original story was in the capital of Valentia, Somnia. She should be able to find something more if she searched there, but finding Estelle could wait, because it was time to work on making antidotes. Outside in the hallway, someone shouted to another person walking by that they could not go to the room because the captain himself had forbidden it. The visitor, Demis, asked what was the problem with a mother visiting her daughter, thinking that if Elodie had asked earlier, she could have prepared a better place. Still wondering why she always insisted on making antidotes right in the mercenaries' headquarters, she remembered when Elodie mentioned that recently Carl and Yancy had been visiting the annex. So she needed a quiet place to work alone, and Demis replied that she needed to tell her children not to bother her so much. After all, Elodie didn't seem to be getting around very well, so she shouldn't be trying too hard. In fact, Demis was curious about the method she was using to create the antidotes and why she was hiding it, but since Elodie didn't want to reveal it, she couldn't really know. But that day, she wanted to talk to her because she was nearby, and she knocked on her room door, asking if she was in there. When there was no response, she abruptly opened the door despite the guard's nervousness. Outside, she felt the smell of poison inside. Even for someone without resistance to poison, just the smell could be painful, as seen by the guard next to her writhing in discomfort. It would have been better if she had told the protagonist not to push herself to the point of falling into such a deep sleep. So she sat down next to the bed, frightened and worried about Elodie, even having made that antidote by herself. She then recalled when Elodie had said that a few days earlier she had awakened her power. It seemed that it was the power to destroy the toxins of a poison. But she knew her own place regarding that, even having said there was nothing to worry about because they were good partners. She hoped her stepmother would be impressed with her skill. Later, Elodie woke up and was shocked to realize Demis was there, and she asked if the girl wasn't hurt anywhere else. She hadn't called for a doctor because it seemed Elodie wanted to hide it, but it appeared she had been dying until a little while ago. The protagonist stammered that she could explain. However, Demis interrupted her, asking if she had to drink poison to make the antidote, if that was why she had been hiding and drinking poison all this time. She hadn't known this before, and yet Demis had asked her to make a large quantity of antidote, which was why she wanted to end their contract. The protagonist was shocked and stammered that no, after all, she needed a capable herbalist. And although the Duchess agreed, she had no interest in poisoning her own daughter. Perhaps Elodie thought she had no right to be with her now, and asked why she was working so hard to earn money. The protagonist hesitated before confessing that she wanted to leave home to become independent, shocking Demis. However, it still made sense, because this should have been happening a long time ago when she suddenly stopped acting and began hiding in the annex. When she remained calm, no matter how Yancy or Carl treated her, since the time she approached her and talked without any hesitation, it was obvious Elodie was preparing to leave. If it hadn't been for the promise, could it be that their relationship was different now? Dealing with her now, she had already broken the promise. If he hadn't said anything, it was probably because he didn't even know what he was doing yet. And Demis said she didn't intend to stop her from trying to become independent. She was almost an adult, and therefore she should have her own ideas now. But she could not cooperate with such methods, and the protagonist apologized for not saying this earlier. Although the Duchess understood that she wasn't comfortable with them, she intended to make things more comfortable for Elodie now. This worried her because her gaze was anything but pleasant, but the Duchess insisted it was nothing special, suggesting they go home now. It wouldn't be long before she lost her job, or rather, she lost her client. She wouldn't have been able to make more antidotes and wouldn't earn money. If she couldn't save money for her independence, she would end up trapped in the guest house. And if the day came when it was revealed that she wasn't Sylvester's daughter, she would end up dying. When she said this out loud, Carl asked who was going to die, making her scream in shock and complain to him for scaring her. Carl asks what she was doing at home that day. After all, she had been out almost every day with a mercenary iron. She changes the subject again, mentioning that he was always entering the wrong places in the house and leaving the door as decoration, wanting to know why he was there this time. He comments that it was banquet day, and their mother said they would be going out to eat, making Elodie freeze in shock because they were all going out together. Later, the entire Perdia family left in a carriage to eat together, but the protagonist already wanted to go home. A man even bumped into her while passing, nearly making her fall if it weren't for Yancy coming over to check if she was okay. Carl threatens the guy who bumped into his sister, forcing him to apologize after the lecture. Even so, Carl insists that he apologized not to him, but to the person he bumped into, asking their father if they could just bury the guy in the ground. Elodie is shocked because Carl was really hot-headed to that point, but suddenly even Sylvester agrees with his son's suggestion, leaving her even more surprised. Finally, Yancy asks them to calm down a bit, leaving the protagonist relieved to have at least one sensible person there. But even colder than his brother, Yancy suggests that if Carl were to use his power, he would end up destroying their surroundings so he could leave everything in his hands. It seemed like he was just making everything worse than before. The protagonist even felt pressured because there wasn't even a hole to hide from that exaggerated family until Demis asked her what she wanted to do. Although Elodie replied that it was just an innocent bump on the shoulders, Demis inquired if she meant she wanted to rip his off, which was beyond what she imagined. The brothers insisted that she didn't have to dirty her hands or worry about what would come next, making Elodie feel bad for the man who touched her. So she just said she didn't want to make a scene. She was starving now and suggested they should just eat. Then everyone decided to agree and follow her, although Carl still focused on the man, commenting that they knew what family he belonged to and he should be careful. This made the protagonist feel like she had saved a life that day. She was already exhausted before she could even eat and was having a bad feeling. At least she hoped nothing would happen until, indeed, when they arrived to eat at the table, a voice approached to talk to them. It belonged to Duke Angelos, smiling at them when he noticed they were all there for a family meal. They were more organized than it seemed. Elodie continued eating, thinking he would make things worse by getting involved this way, as Demis greeted Roberto, asking how Dulcina was doing because it had been a while since she last saw her. She asked him to give her regards when he saw her, and nervously he replied that his wife was recovering. With a sarcastic smile, Demis commented it was a pity and hoped it wasn't contagious, worrying Roberto, although she insisted they could see each other soon at the Temple of Ishtar. But Elodie was more focused on the man behind Duke Angelos. He seemed to be a wizard with green hair and a gloomy look. He was quite suspicious, and she hoped it wasn't just her imagination, especially since it seemed he was avoiding her gaze for some reason. She decided to ask about the identity of this man, and Roberto replied that he was a wizard who had recently been hired by their family, which surprised the protagonist because it was her first time seeing a wizard up close. So perhaps she was being a bit rude, but he laughed because it was only natural to ask as she was curious, eliciting a laugh from Elodie when he said magic was different from power, so it seemed pretty cool. She asked if he had any relation to any magic tower, and the wizard slowly responded that he couldn't reveal his affiliation to someone he had just met, which irritated Carl, who stood up wanting to threaten him. But Demis kicked his foot to make him sit down and avoid being rude. Roberto gestured nervously because his guest had been rude to Elodie, but he hoped a sweet lady like her could understand that and forgive him, and she agreed, allowing the two to turn to leave, bidding goodbye, because they could meet again at the Temple of Ishtar, but the protagonist thought that this wizard could very well have been hired by the Duke. Still, he was strangely obedient, even when Roberto wasn't the type to lower his head to anyone. That was why Elodie realized she would need to make a new request to Ian. Meanwhile, at the Angelos mansion, Dorothea asked her maid if the entire Perdia family had gone out to eat a pleasant dinner, and if Elodie was there. The maid agreed because Viscount Troquel accidentally bumped into her on the streets, and the two young masters protected her. They even tried to punish the Viscount, even Duke Perdia, spreading exaggerated rumors about them and shocking even Dorothea, who was frustrated because this shouldn't be normal. She asked her maid to let her know if there were any more interesting stories next time, sending her away immediately so she could be alone. Alone in her room, Dorothea screamed in anger. She couldn't show herself in public because of her damaged skin, but that bastard child could still appear in fancy restaurants like that, especially with those ridiculous rumors spreading. If that continued, her position in society would be in danger. When her father entered the room, she ran desperately asking when the next apothecary would be arriving because he said he would look for one. He replied that they wouldn't need an apothecary anymore because they had received an invitation to the Temple of Ishtar and should prepare to go now. But Dorothea couldn't understand how they could go there like this, to which her father assured her he could take care of everything, even though Dorothea didn't understand how he could handle it without an apothecary. The Duke showed that the man would help them, gesturing to a person at the door and formally introducing him as Gabe Zenaid. He was a wizard who would assist them. Meanwhile, in the guest house, the protagonist said that this would be her last request to Ian because she was running out of money. He apologized for having told her not to let anyone in, but it was impossible to stop the Duchess. Elodie explained that she needed money, enough to buy a house and live comfortably for the rest of her life. At this, the captain commented that he could give that to her, leaving her a little surprised by such inexplicable generosity, and asked how much it would be, even without knowing what she planned. Ian replied that he could offer as much as she wanted, and Elodie choked on her tea, asking if he would even offer a group of mercenaries if she asked. He again agreed until Mario, one of the Hawk's staff, intervened, shouting to know what kind of stupid question that was, apologizing for interrupting after his captain's unfunny joke. He focused on what kind of request Elodie wanted to make, and she replied that it was an investigation, please, because Mario promised they could do anything. She said she would like to know more about a wizard who had recently been hired by the Angelos family. He had dark green hair tied to one side and purple eyes. Upon hearing this, Mario asked her to give him a week because he would find out even the color of his underwear, although it was a tasteless joke on his part. That was when Ian asked if Elodie had any time because he knew a way to get a lot of money, which made Mario question his captain's words because despite everything, even mercenaries had their limits. But Ian told him to shut up and leave, making him run desperately out of the room after the intense look. Then, Ian explained that soon there would be an item up for auction, and Elodie asked if it would be within the black market, which was problematic because it was full of traps. If her father found out, it would bring trouble. All the under-the-table dealings in the empire were connecting to the Perdius. If she got caught, various irritating things could be questioned, so she inquired what the item in question was, and Ian replied he couldn't tell her now. They would enter with false identities, so she didn't have to worry, but if it was something that could make money for Elodie, she felt it could be worth the effort. She was taken by surprise to hear that the auction would take place in a week, right on the day of the meeting at the Temple of Ishtar. This was the day when the heads of the 4 great families, including the imperial family, along with their spouses and direct descendants, would receive an invitation to the Temple of Ishtar, but Elodie hadn't received any of that before, probably because an illegitimate child wasn't considered a direct descendant. Ian asked if she had anything more important to do that day, and she denied it, agreeing that they could meet in a week. Then the next day at the mansion, Elodie asked Martha what exactly was happening there, because various staff members were bowing to her. Martha explained that before Elodie returned, the Duchess spoke with her and asked a few things, wanting to know if there was another maid serving Elodie besides her. To which Martha explained that it was just her because Elodie didn't like receiving attention from anyone but her, which created doubt in Demis. The protagonist shouldn't have dismissed all her servants suddenly without reason, so she wanted to know what was happening in the guest house. She knew she was the daughter of the maid who took care of Elodie, and therefore Martha. She should know the situation at the guest house better than anyone. She practically grew up with the protagonist and should understand that all this was just for the good of her family. If there was a problem, they should cut it at the root, and that was why Martha told everything to the Duchess. Elodie asked how much she had reported, to which the maid proudly mentioned that she left out the parts that could be a bit rude to the protagonist, but explained most of the things. In front of Elodie, with several other staff members bowing, a woman named Tadalin introduced herself as the supervisor of the guest house. Elodie wondered how the governess from the main house ended up in the guest house like this, questioning what happened to the previous employees. To which Tadalin explained that those who were disrespectful to her were all fired, and of course, they did not receive any kind of recommendation letter, which seemed great for Martha, but shocking for Elodie, who wondered if they were all there to keep an eye on her in case she ended up poisoning someone. That was why she needed to become independent as soon as possible, and under the Duchess's strict supervision, the day for the visit to the Temple of Ishtar was approaching. On this day, Elodie was called by her parents because they wanted to see her before they made the trip and left her for a few days. If she needed anything, she could always ask the butler, and she could also count on Tadalin, which drew a thank you from Elodie because she was fine being alone all those years. Thinking back, she had worried about being called so suddenly, but it seemed to be the usual reminder not to cause problems while everyone was away. So Elodie gestured for them to have a good trip and said she would be returning home now, wondering if she could go out that day. Later, she went to the auction, where people were already excited to buy the items being offered, and the protagonist was quite tense. Something Ian noticed, and she said she just had a bad feeling that if someone found her, things could become a big problem. But the captain assured her that there was nothing to worry about because people were always using false identities, so no one would be especially curious about them. Stammering, the protagonist agreed that no one cared about her until Ian pointed out what they were interested in this time, and Elodie wondered if that was just a cheap jewel. She was shocked because it seemed too simple, and Ian asked her to trust him as it was announced that this was the heirloom that belonged to the royal family. It was starting to be sold for 500, and for now, Elodie bid 510, wondering how much money she had available now, considering it was supposedly an expensive item. Surprisingly, it was sold for only 510, making Ian congratulate her, although Elodie was shocked, wondering if in the end he had tricked her. Until the two returned to the headquarters and Elodie asked how much money they could make with what they had bought. Ian explained that it would be through the use of the power of that jewel because it wasn't ordinary. It was a stone sealed by one of the 7 deadly sins. Elodie knew about these stones. The 7 great families of the empire had sealed the 7 sins, and the Perdia family also kept one. It was being kept in a place where only the head and hair of the family could enter, and Elodie inquired how such a stone ended up for public sale. The captain replied that the 7 families that sealed the sins included the imperial family, and now only 5 of those families remained, questioning where she thought the sins were sealed by the two lost families. This made the protagonist think that she had imagined the imperial family would naturally take care of those seals, but something as important as a sealed stone being put up for sale in the market. It was then that Iron explained that they would invoke the sin using that stone. This made her freeze as she heard that if they could make a contract with the sin, they could use its power in exchange for a price. Despite him explaining things, Elodie interrupted him, asking if he meant they should earn money through this contract. Iron said it was the same, but the process was different. Possessing one of the sealed stones meant they could use the powers of the sins without offering a price, and as a consequence, none of the families knew about this. It was indeed a big secret to be kept, but that was exactly why Elodie wanted to know how he had knowledge of this and what kind of person he was. That was when he began to reveal that in the past, he had made a contract with the sin of pride, which shocked Elodie because that was the sin that was sealed by the deceased Aphrodite family, which should mean that the red stone they bought belonged to the extinct Beaten family, representing greed. Iron agreed that it was exactly that, which made Elodie feel that he didn't want her to delve too deeply into this story, and she wondered if he at least planned to tell everything someday, everything he was hiding. Iron slowly nodded, so Elodie changed the subject, asking how to invoke a sin. He then guided her, explaining that she should first hold the stone. It was safe to touch it, but before Elodie could do that, the stone began to shine a bright yellow, making Iron reach out, shouting for her, but her vision started to fade, and she couldn't grab onto him in time before losing consciousness. When she woke up, she felt a strong headache, still holding the stone, barely having managed to touch the sealed stone, and now she had suddenly ended up there, in some dark place of the palace, wondering where exactly she was now. Even with Iron having told her to invoke the sin, she questioned whether she had been deceived. But it didn't seem to be the case because he looked genuinely surprised. It must have been unexpected for Iron too, so she just stood up, not understanding anything. Upon standing, she spotted a black fox in front of her, enchanted because it was really cute, but it responded that it wasn't a fox, startling Elodie because it spoke. Until the fox explained that it was greed, but Elodie didn't understand why it was talking that way, and greed explained that it was to avoid wasting energy. Then she asked where exactly they were now, and greed replied that she was in the temple where it had been sealed for the first time in the past. This shocked Elodie because it seemed like she had been sent back to the past, and it seemed greed had been trapped there since it was sealed long ago. It felt like she had been teleported inside the place where it had been captured, but she wondered how she could get out of there. Perhaps she couldn't even do that alone. Until Greed commented that she was the first human to visit that place as an unwelcome visitor, and Elodie tried to calm herself because first, she had to come up with a plan to make a deal with Greed and then leave. So she asked if the fox was interested in a deal because she needed its power, and Greed stared at her deeply, wanting to know if she could pay the price. Elodie wondered if that should be the look of sin. After all, it shouldn't have even noticed the stone in her right hand. Maybe Greed was trying to deceive her, so Elodie didn't let herself be shaken and replied that she came there seeking power to make it her servant now that she had the stone in hand, which made Greed recoil. Facing that reaction, she decided they could start with something simple and extended her hand for the fox to give her its paw, making Elodie think it was the cutest thing, even being a sin. And despite saying she would become her new mistress, Greed stated that it already had a master, the great ruler of this world, Akala. But Elodie asserted that she was the owner of its sealing stone, so it should follow her orders now, and she was more interested in knowing how to get out of that place. After a moment, Greed agreed that since they made a deal, they could all leave together, so the protagonist held the fox with both hands, ordering it to leave together, and it was a command. At that moment, Greed wondered why Elodie smelled like its mistress. Meanwhile, at the Temple of Ishtar, the event continued, and Carl felt like he could die of boredom. Certainly, Elodie should feel the same way. He was almost anxious to take a souvenir, like breaking a piece off one of the statues to bring it back as a gift for her. Yancy laughed, telling him to stop with those ideas. After all, Elodie wouldn't like a rock like that, surprising even the worshippers, because they spoke about blasphemy without any hesitation. Until suddenly someone shouted that the oracle had descended because Ishtar said that when the world was engulfed in darkness, humanity would be enveloped in despair and a savior could descend from the heavens. Indeed, something like that happened, but they hardly expected who appeared there, falling into the water, was Elodie herself, wondering what place this was and how she ended up in the temple of Ishtar. But the temple men announced that they had sent a savior, despite the protagonist stammering that they were mistaken, soon being interrupted by the Duke himself. He held the shoulder of the man, saying that she was his daughter. Elodie even tried to stammer a response, but Sylvester just picked her up, telling her to hold on tight, ordering that the prayers come to an end. A little later, they took Elodie to a safe place, asking her to wait after she washed up and rested because they would come to get her. Later, Demis mentioned that there were replacement clothes to wear in the closet, and she could choose any she wanted, as she would catch a cold otherwise. Sylvester concluded by saying he would want to hear the details when he returned, staring into Elodie's soul, making it obvious to her that she would end up being killed afterward. Suddenly, Greed appeared behind Elodie, catching her by surprise because she had shown up out of nowhere, and she responded that she had been there all along, which seemed like a lie. Although she insisted she was telling the truth, it was problematic if other humans saw her, which was why she stayed inside the sealed stone. Elodie questioned why Greed had left her inside the temple, and Greed swore that it was innocent because she didn't know where they would end up until they exited. It was obvious she wouldn't have intentionally thrown Elodie right into the temple of Ishtar, the great enemy of her goddess and mistress Erkala. This made sense to the protagonist because according to the myths, Erkala and Ishtar were sisters, but did not get along. Maybe this was some kind of joke. If it weren't for the fox's fault, perhaps it could be Ishtar's, although it didn't seem to be the case. In the world inside that novel, it was questionable whether gods truly existed, but more importantly, it was obvious that Iron should be worried about her now. Or perhaps not, but in any case, everything would be fine until a little later when Demis appeared to knock on the door, asking if Elodie was there. After a delay, she opened the door, and Carl inquired why she had taken so long, almost breaking down in fear that something might have gone wrong. Slowly, Elodie commented that she got distracted, but she certainly couldn't say it was because Greed refused to return to the sealing stone, and she had to argue with her about it. That damn fox never listened to her, so she hid the stone just when her family was ready to discuss what was happening before, and Elodie asked how the prayers went. Sylvester replied that they were postponed and that the priest would notify them later, but nothing would change because Elodie was still a Perdia. Meanwhile, at the mercenaries' headquarters, when Maria returned, he asked what happened because Elodie had been there until recently and then suddenly disappeared, until Iron ordered that they should find her, searching the entire continent if necessary. In parallel, the Perdia family gathered, demanding answers about what happened to Elodie, and she was preparing to find an appropriate excuse. It would be like a rat staring down a big feline to survive, so the protagonist began to recount that she was out with Iron when she suddenly got teleported to another place within the temple. Even not telling the whole story, it was still true that she ended up in the temple suddenly, but Carl couldn't believe that story. When the fox spoke, the protagonist froze, but it didn't seem like any of them heard its words. It seemed the voice could only be heard by Elodie. However, above all, she was surprised because it seemed he could read her thoughts. But Greed explained that if she focused on her intentions, she could pass them to her. Demis asked how she managed to enter because after the holy barrier was erected, no one could pass, and even Elodie wanted to know about that too. Yancy went on to say that according to the nuns, it could be that she was the true child of the oracle as a true savior, and Elodie nervously laughed, disagreeing until someone knocked on the door asking if they could enter, announcing that the prayer would restart in an hour. Additionally, the high priest ordered that Elodie also attend as the great savior, catching her by surprise and making Greed laugh because she was called that. Even having a pact with one of the sins, she went to attend the prayer, which irritated Dorothea. Roberto imagined that her father had done something to bring her. There were rumors that she had become quite close to the Duke recently, so she managed to attend the event. But this was strange because Dorothea knew there was no way for her to enter. But if it was Sylvester, he could find a way to buy off the church people somehow. If that were the case, it was quite shameless, especially for bringing a bastard to the event. And even Elodie didn't expect to attend the temple this way. As expected, the royal family and the 4 great families were there. She could even see familiar faces like Adamir's, besides the fact that Duke Leon Prundle arrived alone because he wasn't married. But there was a boy with silver hair whom she had never seen before. Perhaps he was from the Severus family, but knowing who he was wouldn't change anything. There was no way to prove that Elodie was the daughter of Duke Severus yet, so she just sat down when someone approached to greet her, and it was Dorothea herself. The protagonist was surprised because she thought Dorothea would be suffering from the poison, but there were no traces of it on her face. She looked more perfect than ever. It was then that Greed explained that she was using an illusion spell with the earrings in her ears, and Dorothea continued, saying it was impressive because Duke Perdia seemed to be growing fond of Elodie, to the point of bringing her here, laughing because even the people around them were talking about her until now. Smiling, Elodie inquired if those were the words from the perspective of the Angelos family, causing Dorothea to stammer that there was no reason to bring her family into this now. She only said it because she was worried about her. Elodie retorted that she was the heiress of the Angelos family, thus claiming that the temple and the Perdia family had some kind of connection was something that could not pass unnoticed. Then, Elodie walked past Dorothea, telling her father to leave things in her hands because she would have a good conversation with Dorothea about this. Still, the Duke said he would do that, asserting that as the priest said, there was no reason to get particularly involved with the temple. Sweating, Dorothea demanded proof of that, and Elodie pressed her because it seemed she was accusing something as serious as dark collaboration. It was she who should provide evidence of that, which made Dorothea hesitate before responding that she had no proof. But it wasn't entirely impossible for this to happen, shouting that with the power of the Perdia family, it would be easy. To which Elodie asked if being suspicious without proof was something worthy of doing, accusing the two in such an impolite manner. If she didn't believe Elodie, then she should ask the Holy One in person to verify if the barrier hadn't been disturbed since they had arrived. Then Roberto approached, telling his daughter to apologize because that was disrespectful, and even complaining. She apologized for making assumptions that disturbed Elodie's peace. Laughing, the protagonist thought it was indeed funny for the proud Dorothea to apologize to her, a bastard child, and she replied that she would prefer a gift instead. She was thinking that Dorothea's earrings were really beautiful, which made her freeze in shock when the protagonist suggested she could keep them as a gift. Nervously, the Duchess asked if she couldn't offer another gift instead of the earrings, drawing a laugh from Elodie, noting that in her case, it seemed she was wearing a ring disguised with illusion magic. The protagonist asked for that ring, which made Dulcina stammer because it was a wedding ring, making Elodie irritated because she couldn't receive an appropriate gift. Until Dorothea finally decided to give her the earrings, thinking it was fine because she could just ask for something new from the wizard when she returned. As long as she was in the same building as Elodie, it was all good until suddenly her earring fell to the floor and broke, shocking Dorothea because that was when her illusion magic unraveled at that very moment, causing her to scream and crouch down while being comforted by her mother, and Elodie laughed, pretending innocence after what happened. Despite the commotion, it forced them to delay the meeting for prayers again, as the entire Angelos family rushed out. They had no choice but to wait for her return. But they said the head needed to be present no matter what, so Roberto remained there, making Elodie wonder why they were provoking someone who was just minding her own business. Then she noticed that the silver-haired boy was focused on her, and she wondered why that was. So she asked Yancy if he knew who the boy was because it was the first time she had seen him, and he replied that he was the representative of the Severs family, Felix Hickelmeyer. He was working as a representative for Duke Severs and was his nephew, becoming the head of the Hickelmeyer family, which normally remained in the state, so it was expected that she had never seen him before. Yancy then asked if she had taken an interest in him, making Elodie deny it immediately, drawing an unhappy laugh from Yancy. Although the protagonist couldn't reveal that Felix was actually like her cousin, so she could never develop any interest in him. There was no way for him to know they were cousins, obviously. However, Elodie took a moment to reflect on this. After all, there wasn't much public knowledge about Duke Severs. He received a formal education at a young age and then took over the duchy before turning 20. A person with silver hair and vivid red eyes, Elodie had only heard that he was an ordinary person. It was about 20 years ago that the Duke disappeared from sight. Rumors spread about how he fell into a coma, but the family never explained what had happened. It was possible that before he fell into a coma, he might have mentioned his mother to those around him, but he never knew she was pregnant to begin with. But who knows, he might have recognized her as the daughter of Duke Severs. Life as their daughter must have been very good too. Until Elodie snapped out of her thoughts when they continued with the prayers at the event, and the protagonist realized they were about to start the verification of the seals of the sins, which took her by surprise. The priest instructed them to present proof of the seals, and she realized it was about the sealing stone of sin. They began with Duke Perdia placing a green stone as the prayer proceeded to confirm that the seal remained intact. Soon all 5 stones were gathered, and Elodie noticed that her stone was reacting to the ritual. It was a very bad feeling that soon caught the priest's attention, and Yancy noticed she seemed strange, saying he could hold her hand as she was worried about something. She sighed because she almost got caught off guard, frustrated because it was greed's fault that the high priest focused on her. If it didn't want to be sealed in the temple, it should have stayed quiet. When the ritual was concluded, the prayer also came to an end, and as Elodie asked if she could go home, they said they would only let her leave the next morning. This was because they would have to finish the breakfast blessed by the goddess Ishtar right at dawn. So when she was alone in her room, she let the fox out, asking if greed didn't need to eat or something like that. It responded that it only fed on emotions, which must mean that Elodie was a person full of greed to keep it satisfied. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door, and the protagonist got up while the fox hid. When she opened the door, she realized it was Adamir, who said he would like to talk to her for a moment, but Elodie turned away, responding that she had nothing to say to him. Perhaps she didn't have anything to say, but Adamir wanted to ask a few things, which made her wonder why he was doing that since he had never shown interest in her before. He'd only treated her as a formal partner during the ball and never really kept her by his side. As it was late at night, if it wasn't urgent, she would send him away. Slowly, he asked how she had arrived at the temple, and Elodie questioned why he wanted to hear from her when he should have heard the rumors from the temple people. As the protagonist commented that certainly that shouldn't be the real reason for his visit, showing up so late at night made her question if it was about breaking the engagement. She almost got excited for that to be the case, prompting Adamir to ask if she wanted that so much. Elodie immediately agreed. Then, the prince asked if she hated him that much, catching her by surprise, before she replied that wasn't true, but she also didn't like him. In fact, it was Adamir himself who didn't like her, and that's why he believed that breaking the engagement was best for both sides. They never should have been together from the start. After a moment, the prince replied that he understood and would seriously consider breaking off the engagement, to which Elodie was surprised that he would actually do that. She affirmed that it wasn't just to get his attention. After all, it was obvious how much she desired for anything they had to come to an end. Since Elodie couldn't become the empress anyway, there was no reason to maintain contact with the imperial family, but this worried her a bit. Because in the original story, Estelle was adopted at 3 years old, and the first prince would fall in love with her at first sight. So she wondered how everything would change if she broke off the engagement now. Then Elodie asked if he would end up getting involved with someone else if she left the engagement now. Given Adamir's confused reaction, she assumed he didn't seem like he would get involved with anyone right away, which made Elodie explain that she just hoped he would find someone special and good for him. Then wishing him good night, the next morning, the barrier of the temple was broken. The high priest seemed to want to talk to the protagonist, but he couldn't get to her because she was always surrounded by the Perdia family. She felt like she was going home now. She couldn't go out again. So Elodie asked her father to let her off at the mercenaries' headquarters on the way back, and he quickly denied it. Dennis went on to say that with the recent attack and the incident at the temple, it would be better for her to take a break. And since Elodie was shaken, Yancy suggested that he could accompany her because there were things he wanted to buy anyway, and so the Duke decided to agree with the idea. Her brother asked if they should hold hands, and Elodie complained because she wasn't a child, seeing him as another cunning fox, and wondered why he always wanted to hold her hand all the time. It didn't take long for Elodie to arrive at the headquarters, asking for Iron, and she heard that the commander was unavailable because he was looking for her. If that was the case, she should let him know she was safe as soon as possible, but she needed to know where he was first. That was when suddenly a voice called for her, and she was abruptly hugged by Iron, who ran desperately because he thought he would lose her again. Seeing this, the fox joked because it seemed like youthful love. Despite appearances, Elodie was quite popular, and she mentally told him to be quiet. As he seemed emotional, the protagonist gently pushed him away and asked him to calm down, holding his face to show that she was safe now. Still thinking about what he had said about something from the past, it seemed that Iron had lost her once too, and that only made her wonder even more about Bayern's past. I noticed that many people who watch our content aren't subscribed to the channel. I need your support to keep making those videos, so if you could help by subscribing, I'd be really grateful. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. See you next time. Bye bye.